Chapter 249. Fan Xian's heart trembled, but his face remained respectful. He lowered his eyes, avoiding the young emperor's gaze, but he was too embarrassed to look at the Empress Dowager. The old faces of the Grand Tutor and the Prime Minister were meaningless, so his gaze naturally fell on the table next to the Grand Tutor. That table was empty. He didn't know which official had not arrived yet. Just as she was thinking, a person walked out from behind a pillar by the Chang Palace pool. He bowed to the Empress Dowager and the Emperor in the hall, and then very naturally sat down at that table. A palace maid had already gone to pour wine. This man was dressed in black. He was tall and slender, full of power. His eyes were as calm as an ancient well, bottomless. The strangest thing was that he wore a chain around his waist. He carried 2 curved knives with him as he entered the hall. This man was quite daring. Fan Xian sucked in a breath of cold air. He tilted his head and asked Lin Jing, "Who is this?" To be able to sit next to the Grand Tutor and bring knives into the palace, he must be an incredible person. Lin Jing quietly introduced him. "This is Imperial Advisor Ku He's first disciple, Sir Lang Tiao. He is the commander of the Imperial Guards in the palace, but I've heard that in recent years, he has mainly been in charge of the Emperor's martial cultivation. He doesn't really manage affairs." Fan Xian made an O sound, as if he had just understood. With a hint of shock, he said, "So this is Miss Haitong's senior disciple. No wonder he has such a high status." At this moment, Lang Tiao's calm gaze had already landed on Fan Xian's face. Fan Xian smiled and raised the wine cup in his hand in a friendly gesture. He gestured to Lang Tiao, his lips slightly parted, and soundlessly said 2 words. "Hello." Lang Tiao frowned. No one knew what he was thinking. After a moment's hesitation, he finally raised the cup in his hand and drank with Fan Xian from a distance. Lin Jing quietly said to Fan Xian, "Sir, this man really should be on good terms with you. It's a pity that you have to leave for home the day after tomorrow. This is your first time meeting him." Fan Xian put on a look of pity, but in his heart, he was wondering if Lang Tiao would recognize him. As he pondered this, Lang Tiao was also puzzled. The expression of the young official of the kingdom of Qing was so natural, and did not seem to be fake at all. Could it be that Shen Zhong had guessed correctly? That the black-clothed man on the cliff was Chen Pingping's shadow guard, and not Commissioner Fan? Fan Xian's heart was calm. He swept his gaze over all the tables in the hall and asked, "Why don't I see Master Shen?" Lin Jing replied, "Although Shen Zhong is the provost of the Discipline Commission, his rank is not high enough to enter the Imperial Palace. Moreover, today is the Empress Dowager's birthday, so he must be in charge of all matters in Shangjing." Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything more. After a while, the ceremonial music in the palace gradually began. The sound of bamboo and string instruments played a magnificent feeling. There were dancers dancing in the hall. Clear light appeared on the ceiling. The birthday banquet officially began. First, the emperor raised his cup to the Empress Dowager and congratulated her on her birthday. Then, the officials below him knelt in order to wish her well. Fan Xian, as a foreign official, sat at the head of the table, and with Lin Jing at his side, secretly reminded him what to do. He passed this stage smoothly. Wine, fruits and vegetables were brought to the hands of beautiful palace maids, quietly and gracefully placed on each table. Every time a palace maid came to serve him, Fan Xian would always turn slightly and smile in acknowledgement. In the eyes of the Northern Qi officials, this was unavoidably a bit artificial, but there were also those who liked him more and more, feeling that this outstanding figure of the younger generation was indeed extraordinary. Fan Xian, on the other hand, looked at the soft eyebrows of the palace maids and felt very uneasy. The young emperor spent every day with these beautiful girls, and yet he had not become a licentious youth. There was indeed something wrong with this. Although the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet was not an ordinary old lady's birthday, there was not much of a difference. It was just that the guests were of a higher class, and the wine and dishes were of a higher level. Naturally, the after-dinner entertainment was also a bit of a headache. This was definitely not the kind of entertainment that Aunt Li, west of Erdo village on Mount Teeling, would have thought of for her 50th birthday. Fan Xian rubbed his temples, a warm smile on his face, but in his heart, He had already begun to curse. Gentle girls now like to call themselves old mothers to be forthright. Boorish men now like to smile shyly to be disgusting. Pig butchers like to eat their neighbors' vegetables. And old nannies with flowers on their heads, who could not get married, like to go around being matchmakers. People all like to get close to the things they were least good at, and like to do the things they were least good at. According to psychology, if you lacked something, you would unconsciously emphasize it. So, under the leadership of the emperor, the kingdom of Qing, which had always been famous for its martial arts, began to walk the road of scholarly governance. Even though there were military generals and martial experts in the capital, poetry competitions were popular. In the palace, imperial concubine Shu was fond of literature, so she was favored. The second prince was well versed in the classics, and won the hearts of the people. Then, out of nowhere, the immortal poet Fan Xian appeared, immediately attracting the gazes and admiration of all scholars. Northern Qi, which had always been the center of literature, was now striving to become stronger. Poetry competitions were no longer popular, but rather preferred to play duels. Instead, they gave up on words and used fists to reason. As a result, the Qing diplomatic mission's entrance was littered with small scimitars. The number of Northern Qi experts who wanted to challenge Fan Xian could form a line from the diplomatic mission's entrance all the way to the valley of Mount Yan. Fan Xian shut himself in, and when he did, he traveled with Haitang. With great difficulty, he had avoided the tragic fate of fighting in the arena every day. Unexpectedly, before he was about to return home, in this great hall, he could no longer avoid it. Master Fan, what do you think of this proposal? The Empress Dowager smiled, and turned her gaze to the table where Fan Xian sat. Although it was a question, her tone was unquestionable. Fan Xian shivered slightly. Earlier, one of the Northern Qi generals had proposed a duel. Although it was a nice way to talk about martial arts, everyone knew that the Northern Qi officials knew that there was nothing they could do about the so-called immortal poet in literature. They were prepared to humiliate him. And for some reason, the Empress Dowager seemed to dislike him. He stood up and swept his gaze across the hall. Suddenly he smiled and said, "Empress Dowager, I do not have the strength to truss a chicken. Let's forget about it." There was a roar of laughter in the hall. No one believed Fan Xian's words. The news of Fan Xian killing Cheng Jushu and beating Yi Ling with a black fist had long since spread throughout the world. He was publicly recognized as a rare man who excelled in both the pen and the sword. The officials had not expected the southern envoy to be so cowardly. The Empress Dowager said calmly, "You are too modest, Master Fan." She said a few more words, not allowing Fan Xian to refuse. Fan Xian's eyelid twitched. No wonder in the transmigration novels he had read in his previous life. All the transmigrators followed Lord Wei's glorious tradition and called the Empress Dowager an old whore. If he gave in now, he would lose face for the court. When he returned to the south, it would be difficult to explain to his father and the old cripple. He did not know what kind of sinister slander would be unleashed in Xinjiang, so he smiled and took half a step back, cupping his hands in acknowledgement. The Empress Dowager's eyes brightened, but the emperor, who sat next to her, looked worried. He asked with concern, "Minister Fan, if you are not feeling well, let's forget about it." Although Fan Xian had only chatted with the emperor a few times, and he had long held a grudge against him, he could hear the genuine concern in his words. He thought of the fact that the emperor was, after all, the emperor. He could not help but feel touched. He raised his head and said in a clear voice, "Your Majesty, even if my blood splatters in front of the hall, let it be a celebration of the Empress Dowager's birthday." These words were neither fish nor fowl, and greatly violated etiquette. They immediately spoiled the atmosphere, and the Empress Dowager's face darkened. The emperor laughed, finding it very interesting. This Fan Xian was indeed gentle on the outside, but stubborn on the inside, and unwilling to be taken advantage of. He waved his hand and said, "These words have gone too far. Since it is a competition, naturally it should be stopped when it is appropriate." The emperor's eyes grew cold. He looked at the officials in the hall and said, "If anyone is unable to control the strength of their attack, then it is best that they do not come out and make a fool of themselves." These words first stopped those who were prepared to hurt him by accident. The officials felt a chill in their hearts. They realized that the speed at which this young emperor had matured over the years was astonishing. The emperor's power was growing stronger and stronger. Even stranger, why was His Majesty treating Fan Xian so well? Was this our emperor, or the emperor of the kingdom of Qing? As soon as the words were spoken, a general walked in from outside the side hall. He bowed to the Empress Dowager and the emperor. In a low voice he said, "I, Cheng Puzhu, wish to learn from Master Fan of the kingdom of Qing." The Empress Dowager nodded slightly. The emperor was aware of Cheng Puzhu's level. He was Lang Tiao's martial nephew, and could be considered a student of the Tianyi faction. He was currently serving in the Imperial Guard, and had probably heard an order from his superiors, so he had come to compete. The emperor had learned from Haitang that Fan Xian was already at the beginning of the 9th level, while Cheng Puzhu was only at the 7th level. Why? The emperor glanced at Lang Tiao, his martial master, and found that Lang Tiao was sitting calmly in his seat, his face expressionless. Cheng Puzhu bowed to Fan Xian and said in a low voice, "Master Fan, you are a master of both the pen and the sword, and your name shakes the world. I ask for your guidance, Master Fan." Fan Xian smiled, and also glanced at Lang Tiao. He knew that the competition in the palace today was not because he was competitive. Rather, it was because Lang Tiao wanted to see his fighting style before he returned home. After he had arrived in northern Qi, he had not fought in front of anyone. Lang Tiao must still have some doubts about the matter at the cliff. He cupped his hands towards Cheng Puzhu. "Lord Cheng." Cheng Puzhu replied in a low voice, "Indeed." Fan Xian said, "You are not a match for me." He then sat down. The officials were in an uproar, thinking that Fan Xian was a bit too arrogant. Just as they were thinking this, they heard a steady voice. "I ask for your guidance, Lord Cheng." Cheng Puzhu was fuming, but then he saw the bodyguard behind Fan Xian take a step forward and stand in front of him. Sunlight shone down from the ceiling of the palace, scattering a clear light. The palace was incomparably bright, so he could clearly see the boundless murderous intent contained in the bodyguard's plain face. It was only one step. Gouda had only taken one step forward, but his entire person had changed. Before, he had been an unremarkable bodyguard, hidden in Fan Xian's shadow. Now that he had taken a step forward, he seemed to have the air of a grandmaster. There was no wind in the palace, but Gouda's junqi flowed through his body, causing his clothes to flutter slightly. Fan Xian used the cover of the table to sit on the floor, holding a small wine cup with 2 fingers. His eyes narrowed. He used his peripheral vision to observe Lang Tiao's expression. Lang Tiao seemed uninterested in what was happening. He held a pair of chopsticks in his hand, picking at the dishes on his plate. But Fan Xian's eyes were sharp, and he saw Lang Tiao's chin move slightly. This was a sign of agreement. Cheng Puzhu took a deep breath. He looked at Gouda in front of him. Everyone in Shangjing knew that he was an expert bodyguard of the Southern Diplomatic Mission. He had once subdued General Tan Wu, a subordinate of General Shang Shan, in one move. He was a true master. But things had come to this, and Cheng Puzhu could not back down. He shouted, "Your Majesty, please permit me to use my saber." Although the young emperor admired Fan Xian, he was no fool. He knew that he was the emperor of northern Qi, and he rather admired this general's courage and power. With a look of approval, he said, "Permit it. General Cheng, do your best. This is purely a martial competition. Do not think of it as the face of the court. Whether you win or lose, I will reward you." The Empress Dowager looked at her son, her eyes full of disapproval. But the young emperor smiled, as if he did not see his mother's gaze. The 2 brothers, Lin Wen and Lin Jing, were extremely nervous. They were about to leave for home, so how could they cause such a ruckus in the palace? If they won, northern Qi would lose face, and that would not be good. If they won, the Qing court would lose face, and that would be even worse. But the officials of the kingdom of Qing had developed a natural ruthlessness over the decades. Seeing the other side's provocation, even though they were civil officials, they were truly angry. They said to Gouda, "Guard Gao, don't go overboard. Talk of victory before the battle." Fan Xian glanced at the 2 deputies beside him and laughed bitterly. He thought to himself that these two were even more arrogant than him. Turning his head toward the emperor on the dragon chair, he said, "Your Majesty, please allow my subordinate to bring a knife into the palace." The emperor smiled at him and waved his hand. Outside the palace, it was known that there would be a martial competition. Today was the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet, so the palace had been lax. Furthermore, the emperor had given his approval, so the officials who had been eating in the side hall all rushed to the entrance of the palace, casting their eager gazes upon the field. A young eunuch fetched Gao Da's long saber from the palace's corner door and handed it to the eunuch in front of the palace. Fan Xian saw Wang Qinian standing at the entrance of the palace, sneakily looking in their direction. He couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. He wondered if Wang Qinian's hands were itching to return to his old profession and search for something in the palace. Gao Da gripped the hilt of the long saber with both hands, and his entire mental state immediately entered a very strange state. The power from before was gone, and the oppressive feeling no longer existed. All that was left on the field seemed to be only one saber. Even though it was one man and one saber, in the eyes of a spectator, there was still only one saber. Lang Tao put down his chopsticks and looked at the unique long saber in Gao Da's hands. He seemed to have thought of something, and his brows furrowed slightly. Cheng Puzhu and Gao Da stood facing each other. Looking at their opponent, who was standing steadily, they cast aside all distracting thoughts. Taking a deep breath, they slowly pulled out the curved saber from its sheath. The blade scraped against the mouth of the sheath, making a hot-blooded metallic sound. Gao Da still did not move, holding the long saber with both hands. His entire body leaned a few inches to the right. Cheng Puzhu slowly circulated his junqi, pouring it into his wrist. He felt as if his forearm had become one with the curved saber. Only then did he raise the blade slightly. He was Lang Tao's disciple nephew, and belonged to Kuhi's faction. Although he was only a 7th-level martial artist, he had the self-confidence that his master had bestowed upon him. His opponent could be arrogant, but he would not. The saber flashed like snow. The distance of several feet between the two masters seemed to not exist. In a flash it disappeared. In the next moment, Cheng Puzhu had already appeared in front of Gao Da. The two were very close, as if their faces were touching, and their bodies were touching. And that snow-like saber light came from Cheng Puzhu's hand. The curved saber was strangely hanging upside down. He raised it high, and the tip of the saber was aimed straight for Gao Da's left shoulder. The distance between the two was too close. Even Cheng Puzhu could only hang the curved saber upside down, using this treacherous and unpredictable method to stab. Furthermore, Gao Da was holding the long saber with both hands. At this moment, there was no way he could unsheath it. Even if he did, there was no way he could use it at such a short distance. Cheng Puzhu lived up to his reputation as an extraordinary master. In a short time, he had relied on his opponent's weapon to come up with a plan to subdue him. The officials were slightly startled. It seemed that they were about to see blood spurt from Gao Da's shoulder. Fan Xian frowned slightly. It seemed that he had not expected Cheng Puzhu's attack to be as swift as lightning. Crack! An extremely unpleasant sound rang out. Immediately after, there was a shattering sound, followed by another muffled sound. In the next moment, the Empress Dowager, the Emperor, and the officials watching from outside all watched in shock as a figure was sent flying. Cheng Puzhu landed heavily on the ground. His face was covered in blood. It seemed that he had suffered a grievous injury. The crowd thought that Gao Da had used Jinqi to send Cheng Puzhu flying, and they couldn't help but be shocked. To send a 7th-level master flying with Jinqi, other than the 4 grandmasters, perhaps only a few 9th-level masters could do so. And Gao Da was only a bodyguard of the Qing diplomatic mission. Only the martial masters present could clearly see what had happened. When Cheng Puzhu's curved saber came down, Gao Da did not draw it. Instead, he held the long saber with both hands and brought it down. The hilt of the long saber was about an inch wide, and it was this small area of the hilt that met the tip of Cheng Puzhu's curved saber. The long saber in Gao Da's hands was as tall as a man. As he raised the saber, the scabbard stood firmly on the ground. So when the tip of the curved saber pierced the hilt, it was as if all of Cheng Puzhu's Jinqi and power had been transferred through the long saber in Gauda's hand to the bluestone floor beneath his feet. Gauda remained uninvolved. He watched as Chung Puju's attack, which he had been preparing for a long time, collided head-on with the ground. In the future, even if you were a grandmaster, so what? In that instant, Chung Puju felt an extremely powerful force pass through the tip of the saber, making it hard for him to breathe. And at that moment, Gauda put down his saber and cupped his fists. His arms seemed to form a circle, and he turned to the left. The steel-like tip of his right elbow struck Chung Puju's chin heavily. The blow was so powerful that it knocked out his opponent's teeth and split his lips. Blood flowed freely. Gauda had been merciful. Otherwise this blow would have killed Chung Puju. Rather than saying that Chung Puju had been defeated by Gauda, it would be better to say that he had been defeated by the earth. A eunuch had already helped Chung Puju out of the room for treatment. Gauda calmly bowed to the emperor and the empress dowager, pulled out his long saber, and slowly retreated behind Fan Xian. With a crack, the bluestone floor where they had fought earlier began to crack inch by inch. Only now did the officials in the hall realize that the unsheathed long saber had been driven into the bluestone by Chung Puju's curved saber. What kind of power was this? Understanding that Gauda had used a trick, the officials began to talk among themselves. But they didn't say anything. Fan Xian looked at the expressions of the Northern Qi officials and smiled a little self-deprecatingly. In their eyes, this smile was a little repulsive. Fan Xian handed his cup of wine to Gauda behind him. Gauda was slightly taken aback. He took the cup and drained it in one gulp. "Thank you for the wine, sir. Thank you for your guidance." He didn't know what guidance Fan Xian had given him. Fan Xian smiled. It should be to thank the Empress Dowager for bestowing. Before he could finish, he realized that the hall had suddenly fallen silent, including the officials and eunuchs outside the hall. Because Lang Tiao had spoken. Lang Tiao smiled at Fan Xian. "Sir Fan's little tricks truly live up to their reputation. I didn't expect even your bodyguard to understand them." Having said this, he stood up and gently took off his outer robe, handing it to a palace maid behind him, revealing the two curved sabers at his waist. The hall buzzed. Sir Lang Tiao was about to appear. Lang Tiao was the first disciple of the imperial advisor and the emperor's martial teacher. The officials in Beijing had not seen him in action for many years. Who would have thought that he would make an exception for the people of Qing today? The officials turned their burning gazes to Lang Tiao, but because of his special status, they didn't dare say anything. Before Lang Tiao had walked out, Fan Xian had already laughed and waved his hand. "I'm no match for you." Earlier, he had directly said that Chung Puju was no match for him. Now he admitted that he was no match for him. In the ears of the Northern Qi people, he seemed somewhat open and above-board. Lang Tiao smiled. "Whether or not I'm a match, we'll only know after we fight." Fan Xian's heart trembled. He knew that if he really did fight with this ace, first, if he didn't use his hidden crossbow, poison needles, and aphrodisiac powder, then he wouldn't be able to last more than 3 rounds. Second, if Lang Tiao really did confirm that he was the man at the edge of the cliff, given Ku He's endless concealment of the temple, he would probably be hunted down. His brows furrowed tightly, but he knew that Lang Tiao had given the Qing people enough face by personally challenging them. He could not let Gauda fight again. Just as his heart was gradually hardening, and he was about to act, he heard a voice. "Senior brother, let me do it." Fan Xian was happy. Very happy. The people of Northern Qi were also happy, and those watching were even happier. Haiteng slowly walked out from behind the Empress Dowager and bowed slightly to Lang Tiao. "Elder brother, let me do it." Seeing that it was her, Lang Tiao's expression softened. "That's fine, of course, but you have to be careful of Sir Fan's methods." Haiteng bowed to the Empress Dowager and the Emperor, but didn't say anything. She walked in front of Fan Xian and smiled. "Are you coming?" "Of course, why wouldn't I?" The two of them didn't feel like they were talking to each other, like children playing house. Of course, the people of Northern Qi, who had surrounded the Great Hall in 3 layers, didn't notice. Even the officials of the Qing diplomatic mission didn't notice. Everyone had sunk into some kind of anticipation. This kind of anticipation had already surpassed victory and defeat, and surpassed the prestige of the 2 countries. They simply wanted to see what would happen in a moment. One was the immortal poet of Qing, skilled in both the pen and the sword. He had become the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, at the tender age of less than 20, Fan Xian. The other was the Northern Qi goddess, the youngest superior 9th-level ace after Ku He. She was a legendary Tianmai, and was believed to be the most likely to become the 5th great grandmaster, Haidang. Both of them were the most famous of the younger generation. It was rumored that the two of them had traveled around Shangjing, forgetting to return home. It seemed that they appreciated each other. This also proved that the two of them were indeed on the same level. The two of them were finally going to meet. After some time, Wang Qinian, who was standing guard at the door to the great hall, yawned. Looking at the young man and woman fighting in the hall, he muttered, "Who are they trying to fool?" A eunuch next to him said indignantly, "They're actually faking a fight in front of the great hall. Lady Haitang, how could you bear to disappoint us onlookers?" Wang Qinian said unhappily, "I didn't take your money, so naturally they weren't acting seriously. So what if it was a fake fight? Based on their status, I'm afraid even His Majesty the Emperor would be too embarrassed to expose them." Chapter 250. On the other side, Fan Xian's movements were clumsy. He held his palms horizontally and vertically, chopping back and forth like a kitchen knife. How could there be any nimbleness? Every time he struck out with his palm, there was a strong gust of wind that whistled and cut through the air. It looked overbearing, but each palm struck the air around Haitang. He had no intention of touching the girl's skin at all. He only lifted the corners of Haitang's coarse clothes. What technique was this? This was the technique Wu Bai always used when he went on stage to sing with an electric fan in front of him. This was the technique Stephen Chow threw newspaper pieces in front of the fan and unbuttoned the pajamas of the main characters. Haitang's clothes were like clouds. She smiled amidst the wind from the palms. On the long imperial platform, accompanied by water and light, she was as ethereal as a fairy. She floated as if she wanted to ride the clouds and fly away. Occasionally, she would point to the east, then to the west. No one knew where she was pointing to. This was not a trick of pointing to the east or striking to the west. It was a young girl's way of commanding troops. The two of them fought like this for who knew how many rounds, but there was not the slightest hint of smoke or fire. Since they did not think of blood, their attacks were naturally light. It was like a vegetarian meal in a temple that did not even bear to use soybean oil. It was so light that it was nauseating. Even a young eunuch could see that the two masters were pretending to fight, not to mention the old foxes and young foxes in the hall. Some of the officials' eyes had long since widened. They had not expected Haitang and Fan Xian to be so thick-skinned as to not care about the face of the court at all. The Empress Dowager looked at the long platform in the hall and the two figures in the clear light. She could not help but snort coldly, although she did not lose her composure. The fine lines at the corner of her eyes were full of hidden anger. Instead, it was the young emperor who watched Fan Xian and Fan Xian float around in the clear light and could not help but laugh. Lang Tiao's face was calm as he watched the scene unfold. He knew that Fan Xian's seemingly clumsy attack was actually a very powerful coffin breaker. But that was a martial art passed down through the generations of the Yi family in the capital. How did this Fan kid learn it? Inside and outside the hall, the expectant crowd was finally disappointed. After watching for so long, some people could not help but yawn. The eunuch in front could not help but shake his head. Who knows how long this will last? In any case, there is no winner or loser. Wang Qinian also shook his head regretfully. I think someone is going to stop it soon. The young eunuch didn't believe it and shook his head. The officials in the hall are all shrewd people. Who would step forward? Wang Qinian started to argue with him. Finally, they got excited and started to bet on when the two people dancing on the long imperial platform would stop. Several people on the side saw that they were fighting excitedly, so they also came over and placed their own bets. One card of sea urchins, 2 cucumbers, and all kinds of strange bets were placed. Impudent. Finally, a minister looked at the Empress Dowager's increasingly gloomy face and couldn't bear it any longer. He slammed the table and stood up, angrily rebuking, "What are you doing at the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet? Are you trying to deceive me?" These words were not beautiful, just like a stupid child who cried out that the emperor was running around naked. No matter how ugly the world was, whoever cried out the truth first would be an extremely unlikable fellow. Just like today, even though he knew that Fan Xian and Haitang were playing the Chongling swordplay, he didn't cry out. The Empress Dowager could still thicken her face and watch. After all, it was her birthday today. Watching young children dance was not a big deal. But this minister's cry was deceiving the emperor. Wasn't that forcing the Empress Dowager to fly into a rage? So the Empress Dowager prepared to fly into a rage. She looked coldly at the minister, countless thoughts running through her mind. She wanted to tear his lips apart. The emperor was still smiling. In the pool, the two people on the imperial platform acted as if they hadn't heard the cheers of the audience. They acted seriously. Haitang floated back and forth. Fan Xian walked like a dragon or a tiger. The girl's figure was clear and beautiful, and little Fan Xian's appearance was handsome. It was really a good fight. In just a moment, they had fought from the imperial platform to the front of the palace behind it. They were only a few feet away from the dragon chair, and they stopped in front of the minister's table. Fan Xian's palm turned into a kitchen knife and chopped down viciously on the empty chopping board. He let out a cry, as if he had missed. Haitang's posture in the air was slightly sluggish. Two fingers of her right hand stabbed out like a sword. With a swish, she was about to strike Fan Xian's chest. No one knew how the two of them changed positions. But in the next moment, the wind from their palms and fingers did not strike anyone's body. Instead, with a swish, they surged forward. Behind them was the minister's seat. The minister was aghast, with Haitang and Fan Xian attacking at the same time. Even if Imperial Advisor Ku He were here, he would still have to temporarily avoid the brunt of the attack. The short table was instantly shattered into countless pieces. The wine jug on the table cracked, and the dishes fell. The smell of wine and oil filled the air, staining the minister's head and face. His brow was covered with cauliflower, his mouth was full of radish, and a few strands of golden mushrooms hung from his ears. The soup and water had washed his face. He was as miserable as one could imagine. The hall immediately quieted down. Only now did the ministers realize that Miss Haitang and the Southern Emperor's envoy were sometimes troublemakers. For the sake of their own reputation, it was best not to say anything more. Fan Xian and Haitang stopped fighting at the same time. Separated by a few steps, they looked at each other and smiled. Haitang bowed slightly to the Empress Dowager. Master Fan, your coffin breaker technique is impressive. My daughter did not respond properly, and thus affected you. I hope the Empress Dowager will forgive me. People can make mistakes. Fan Xian's face was also full of self-blame. He waved his right hand. A horse can make a mistake. The Empress Dowager loved Haitang dearly, and did not want to blame her. Besides, today was her birthday banquet, and making a scene to liven up the atmosphere was not bad. It was a pity that the Southern envoy had not suffered. But seeing Fan Xian's self-deprecating words, the Empress Dowager could not help but smile faintly. The Emperor also laughed strangely, and the ministers also laughed awkwardly. Only the true masters of the martial way knew that the seemingly joking fight actually contained some of the thoughts of the two young masters. The coffin breaker seemed crude, but it was actually stern. Haitang's finger sword seemed gentle, but it was actually fierce. The long dance on the imperial platform was also a kind of competition. But in the end, it seemed that Fan Xian had still lost. Now that the fake fight was over, the clear light from the roof still shrouded the secluded hall. Fan Xian and Haitang stood in the clear light. Their faces looked incomparably gentle in the light. The half-moon lantern that had fallen from the roof of the hall was reflected in the pool. This competition could be said to be a true laughing contest. The bright river and the moon shamed the palace. Night gradually enveloped the depths of the palace. The half-moon slowly climbed up from behind the green mountain behind the palace, spilling its warm and faint light into the northern Qi Palace. The long black eaves and the gray and white palace walls reflected a beautiful figure at the beginning of the night. The ministers in front of the main hall were retreating out of the palace. Many guards could be seen around the palace, and there were also eunuchs waiting on the road. The speed at which the courtiers retreated was extremely fast. In a short while, the imperial palace regained its tranquility. There were no longer any miscellaneous people on the empty square. It only took the time it took to burn a stick of incense to turn from bustling to extremely quiet. After the banquet ended, the Empress Dowager rubbed her temples and returned to her bedroom. Fan Xian was left behind by the Emperor of Northern Qi, waiting in Huaying Palace. The palace was incomparably quiet. The faint scent of incense wafted into his nose. Fan Xian sat with his eyes closed. The Emperor of Northern Qi should be in the Empress Dowager's palace, fulfilling his filial duties. He didn't know why he was waiting here. The palace maids brought him tea and fruit. Fan Xian smiled and thanked them one by one. He found that the palace maids were all very charming, especially the slight shyness in their eyes, which made his heart flutter. But when he thought of the young emperor leaving him in the palace, and how the emperor seemed to have some problems in certain areas, Fan Xian's heart trembled. His Majesty has something he needs your help with, Master Fan. The other girl, who was looking down, seemed to have guessed his fear and said calmly. The one who spoke was Haitang. Fan Xian was staying in the palace as a guest, so she had to be half a host. The girl thought of the scene in the hall earlier, and felt a little dazed and amused. Why was it that when she was with Fan Xian, she always seemed more presumptuous than usual? Fan Xian smiled and didn't explain. A eunuch shouted something from outside the palace. A series of hurried footsteps approached Huaying Palace. Fan Xian thought, why the rush? What does this young emperor want me to do for him? He is the emperor of the 9 and 5. Apart from unifying the world, there is nothing he can't do. While Fan Xian was full of questions, the young emperor had already stepped into Huaying Palace. With a wave of his hand, he stopped Fan Xian and Haitang from paying their respects. With his right hand, he took off his outer robe and threw it to a young eunuch who followed behind him. Only the thin yellow robe was left, and he looked very spirited. Then the emperor sat down on the couch. With a push of his feet, a eunuch carefully took off his boots, revealing his feet, which were only wrapped in thin socks. Perhaps Haitang was used to seeing the emperor in private, so she wasn't surprised. Fan Xian was a bit surprised that the Northern Qi emperor had revealed such a private side in front of him. He didn't hide his surprise. Turning his gaze toward the soft couch, he even, intentionally or unintentionally, tapped the emperor's chest and feet a few times. Not big, not small. Not big, not small. Chapter 251. Mother likes peace and quiet. The young emperor leaned back on the couch and took a sip of the swallow's nest that a eunuch had brought him. He frowned and waved his hand for all the palace maids and eunuchs to leave. The palace hall immediately quieted down. Fan Xian bowed slightly. What are your orders, Your Majesty? Seeing how cautious the southern envoy was, the Emperor of Northern Qi smiled. Minister Fan, he said, you will be leaving for home the day after tomorrow. Make sure you take good care of the first princess. Fan Xian was startled. Only now did he realize that he had not been paying attention to this important matter. Welcoming the first princess back home to be married was an important matter. There could be no mistakes on the journey. These days, he had long learned from Yin Bingyan that this great princess of Northern Qi had been raised deep in the palace. She was the half-brother of the emperor in front of him. Her birth mother had long died in some cold palace. The great princess had never been liked by the Empress Dowager, which was why she was willing to let her become a sacrifice in a political marriage. He didn't know why the emperor had suddenly mentioned the first princess. Logically speaking, the emperor should not have had much of a relationship with that sister. But seeing the faint worry on the emperor's face, Fan Xian knew that he had guessed wrong. As expected, the emperor sighed. The first princess has never left the palace. Now that she is married off to the south, even though I am the son of heaven, I cannot protect her. Fan Xian said sincerely, do not worry, Your Majesty. The great prince is a hero of our kingdom, and is most respected by the people. The great princess and the great prince will certainly live in harmony in the future, and they will grow old together. All the officials in the court will treat the princess with respect, and will not dare to slight her. The emperor laughed coldly. What use is that? He suddenly stared into Fan Xian's eyes. Minister Fan, I see you as a friend. I hope that while you are in Nanjing, you will give the first princess some advice. You must ensure that she lives a happy life. Fan Xian was shocked again. He had only met the emperor 4 times. How could he dare be a friend of the Son of Heaven? Seeming to guess what he was thinking, the emperor smiled and said, Minister Fan, when we first met, I said that I liked your poems and often recited them. Those words were as if you were speaking. Since I have spoken to you for a year, it is not surprising that I regard you as my friend. At this moment, Fan Xian was truly overwhelmed by the favor and ashamed. Just as he was about to kowtow to thank the emperor and cry out in fear, he heard the Northern Qi Emperor's light voice ring out. There was a glimmer of anger in the voice. But Minister Fan seems to be distancing himself from me. Not to mention the fact that he refuses to come into the palace to talk to me. The Northern Qi Emperor suddenly looked into his eyes. Even if there are many things you still hide from me. Fan Xian was worried. He explained, there are many matters to attend to. I am busy with both Honglu Temple and Taichung Temple. I dare not leave the palace and disturb your majesty's rest. The Northern Qi Emperor glanced at the silent Haitang and suddenly smiled. Is that so? I thought that these days, the most you have done is accompany my aunt disciple to go shopping and drink. Hearing this, even Haitang could not continue to sit still. With a trace of unease she replied, Duo often asks Sir Fan for guidance on the way of the heavens, and has benefited greatly. His Majesty shook his head and looked at Fan Xian. Then how long do you intend to keep that matter hidden, Minister Fan? A drop of cold sweat emerged from Fan Xian's hair, but it refused to slide off his forehead or reveal the fear in his heart. It only remained in his long black hair. Fan Xian's first thought was, had Sea Lily's matter been exposed? If that was the case, then even if the emperor in front of him did not like women, the Son of Heaven's desire to monopolize power would not allow him to leave Northern Qi alive. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that Haitang's calm face was calm, without a trace of fear or unease. He felt a little more at ease. He coughed twice and respectfully asked, What matter does your majesty speak of? No one knew about Xiaowen's matter, except for Haitang, who might have guessed a little. As long as it was not about Sea Lily, Fan Xian would not feel the slightest bit of guilt or fear when facing the Northern Qi Emperor. Unexpectedly, the Northern Qi Emperor's next question almost made Fan Xian fall off his chair. Tonight's conversation in the palace was one of shock after another. I have come to ask you, how is your sister Lin? The Northern Qi Emperor looked at Fan Xian coldly. It was like a bolt of lightning had struck deep into the palace, like a girl crying out in the middle of a thunderstorm. Fan Xian was dumbstruck, his body stiff. For a moment he did not know how to answer. How could this emperor know that Wan was his cousin? That was to say, he knew his true identity. That was impossible. That was impossible. There were no more than 5 people in the world who knew of his true identity, and those 5 people could not have leaked this shocking secret. But the problem was, the Northern Qi Emperor was the Son of Heaven, and had countless capable subordinates. Could it be that he had discovered this matter from some traces in yellow papers? Otherwise, why would he suddenly ask about his own wife, his sister Lin? The Northern Qi Emperor looked at him coldly. Seeing his panicked expression, he suddenly slapped the armrest of the soft couch and scolded. Speak! Speak, my ass! Fan Xian's expression was mostly faked, but he still maintained a strong calm inside. His left pinky slightly crooked, but he suddenly remembered that because he was afraid that Haitang would find out about his connection to the incident at the cliff, he had not brought the black dagger on his left leg these days. Fight! He could not beat Haitang. Escape? If Northern Qi revealed his identity, wouldn't the Crown Prince, the Great Prince, and the Second Prince immediately become a pack of hungry tigers? And those women deep in the palace? Fan Xian coughed, and a smile reappeared on his face. Since the emperor had said it in front of him, naturally, he was prepared to threaten him. So he prepared to play dumb and listen to the emperor's conditions first. Your Majesty, what are you talking about? The Northern Qi Emperor stood up, stepping on the soft boots. He couldn't be bothered to put them back on. Just like this, he walked directly toward Fan Xian. The expression on his face gradually brightened. From the slight anger earlier, it turned into a faint smile. In that smile, there was a hidden sense of excitement and anticipation. Seeing this expression, Fan Xian was startled. He was even more certain that this little brother of the emperor was a little pervert. A pair of hands grasped Fan Xian's shoulders, and the Northern Qi emperor somewhat lost his composure as he shook Fan Xian's shoulders. His eyebrows danced, and he laughed brightly. Minister Fan, oh Minister Fan, you have kept me in the dark. You have kept everyone in the world in the dark. Ah! Fan Xian had long since given up on the idea of forcing the Northern Qi emperor to flee to the ends of the world. He looked somewhat stupidly at the face that was so close to him, and found that the emperor was quite good-looking. The emperor bathed every day, and his breath was quite fresh. Haidang looked at the emperor's fervent expression, and at Fan Xian's stupidity, and could not help but laugh. Grandmaster Chao. The Northern Qi emperor shook him again, making Fan Xian dizzy. Grandmaster Chao. Quick, tell me, did Sister Lin end up with Baoyu? He finally understood what was going on. Although he did not know how the Northern Qi emperor had guessed this, Fan Xian could no longer bear the torment of surprise and joy. He sat down on a chair, and without saying anything else, he picked up the teacup beside him and took 2 gulps. The emperor looked at him with a smile. If you do not finish telling me the story of the stone, I will not allow you to leave the palace. Fan Xian sighed. How did your majesty know that the story of the stone was written by me? The emperor looked at Haitang, and Haitang smiled. Books are only published by Dombo Bookstore. Mr. Chao has always been a recluse, and other than Dombo Bookstore, no one else knows who he is. The story of the stone is very popular, and who knows how many people have tried to guess who he really is. The day before yesterday, when we were drinking, Sir Fan seemed to have talked a little too much, and naturally, I guessed a little. Today, Your Majesty has tried to trick me again, and since Sir Fan has admitted it, I guessed correctly. Fan Xian smiled bitterly, not knowing what to say. In truth, he did not really need the reputation of being the author of the story of the stone. Seeing how the Northern Qi emperor had called him Grandmaster Chao so intimately, he had almost mistaken him for Guojia. Presumably, he was also a fan of the story of the stone. Having confirmed that Fan Xian was the author of the story of the stone, the Northern Qi emperor seemed very happy. Quickly tell me, he said, how many girls did Baoyu marry in the end? Fan Xian laughed in spite of himself, thinking that this emperor was a fan of harem novels. He waved his hands and pleaded, Your Majesty, I have only randomly written some 60 chapters. I have not thought of the rest. As he said this, he thought of Ruoro and Danzhou, when she had asked him to write. He had thought of the problems of writing, updating, and leaving it unfinished. It was a very troublesome matter. Hearing this, the Northern Qi emperor sighed and frowned. He glanced at Haitang, who was resting to the side. Suddenly, he moved closer to Fan Xian's ear and said in a low voice, The Haitang Poetry Society in Chapter 37. What does it have to do with Aunt Master? Out of the corner of his eye, Fan Xian saw that the corners of Haitang's eyes had softened slightly. He knew that she was eavesdropping, and so he smiled and replied boldly, Your Majesty, the author cannot explain himself. Forgive me for not saying more. The emperor revealed a hint of warmth and said, Then return quickly, Minister Fan. Once you have a chapter, remember to send it to me. Fan Xian accepted the order fearfully, not daring to say more. Chapter 252. Walking on the bluestone path of the palace, the full moon in the sky and the 2 of them in the forest, Fan Xian's back was already soaked with sweat. Even in this summer night, he still felt a little cold. He let out a breath of turbid air, still feeling a little scared. Patting his chest, he complained to Haitang beside him. You guessed that I wrote Story of the Stone. Why didn't you tell me? You almost scared me to death with that emperor of yours. Haitang laughed. Who told you to hide it from the world for so long? Then she rolled her eyes. Why are you so afraid? If it wasn't for your identity as Grandmaster Chao, then what were you afraid of His Majesty saying? Fan Xian didn't even think about it. He smiled gently. What do you think? The corners of Haitang's mouth curled up slightly. She said nothing. Fan Xian tilted his head to look at her. He saw that her long eyelashes were tinged with a layer of silver, giving her a kind of pure beauty. Her eyes, the most outstanding feature of her face, were especially bright in the night. The silver moonlight really did have a kind of magic. That kind of haziness seemed to be able to turn any ordinary woman into a worldly fairy. Fan Xian didn't feel anything. He just put his hands behind his back and slowly walked forward. You tricked me this time. I'm not seeking revenge. You should know why. You want me to help you with something. Haiding smiled. Although I don't know what it is, I think it has something to do with the South. That's why you need an outsider like me to help you. That's right. You and I are actually both hypocrites. Fan Xian's lips curled into a strange self-deprecating smile. So when we talk, it seems we can be a little more direct. What I need you to help me with may or may not happen. In any case, when the time comes, I will send someone to inform you. Haiding looked at him and suddenly said, I hear that you love the illegitimate daughter of the Prime Minister very much. That's why you haven't even taken in the head servant, that grandmother in Danzhou. I don't like you probing into my family matters. Fan Xian turned his head and said seriously, this topic ends here. Haiding smiled and nodded. Actually, I'm just curious. What kind of person would feel comfortable when they see women and uncomfortable when they see men? They would think that unmarried women are pearls and married women are fish eyeballs. They would think that women are made of water and men are made of mud. They would think that women are precious and men are lowly. After a long string of words, Haiding stared into Fan Xian's serene eyes and said softly, I am very curious. In this world, men are respected. Why does Master Fan have such views? Fan Xian smiled and did not reply. Haiding suddenly curtsied and said seriously, on behalf of all the women in the world, Duo thanks Master Fan for establishing a legacy for the boudoir and fighting for women's rights. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, I am different from most people in this world. After leaving the palace, Haiding was surprised to find that the Grand Tutor was still standing guard outside the palace. Fan Xian's expression did not change when he saw His Majesty's teacher. Presumably, he had already known about it. Haiding bowed to the Grand Tutor, and then turned to Fan Xian. I will see you off the day after tomorrow. Fan Xian understood the hidden meaning in her words. He nodded and got into the Grand Tutor's carriage. Watching the 3 carriages gradually disappear into the night of Shangjing, Haitang's bright eyes suddenly became unfocused. She thought about the last words of that handsome young official from the south. Different. In the eyes of the world, Fan Xian was naturally different. But she did not know how he thought he was different. The carriages stopped outside a quiet courtyard. The imperial soldiers responsible for the diplomatic mission's safety finally learned that the great scholar of southern Qi, Fan Xian, had made his last visit in northern Qi. He had come to see this master. Thinking of the poem duel that had been rumored all over the world, they could not help but feel uneasy. They did not know what Fan Xian was thinking, but in this courtyard filled with books, they naturally quieted down. The tiger guards in the first carriage got out. Their eyes were fierce, and they guarded a few key points. Fan Xian and the Grand Tutor of Northern Qi walked down from the carriage hand in hand. Although their attitude was not necessarily friendly, it did not seem to be hostile either. Everyone felt a little more at ease. They saw the Grand Tutor, who had always been upright and outspoken, quietly say something to Fan Xian, and the two of them pushed open the door and entered. Fan Xian waved his hand, indicating that the tiger guards should not follow. Outside a room in the courtyard, the Grand Tutor bowed deeply to the inside of the room. He turned back to Fan Xian and said calmly, Master Fan, my teacher has not been well recently. Please do not talk for too long. Fan Xian politely bowed to the great scholar, tidied his clothes, and gently pushed open the wooden door. Looking out, he saw an old man holding a small brush and scribbling something on a piece of paper. This old man was a master of scripture, and his students were spread all over the world. The Grand Tutor of Northern Qi and Shu the scholar of Southern Qi were both his disciples. Before Fan Xian revealed his brilliance, no one could compare to him in scholarly matters. Even after Fan Xian shamelessly defeated Guo Jingming in the palace hall, in an attempt to win by a fluke, no one truly believed that other than poetry, Fan Xian had reached the level of Guijingming in other areas. This was because the old man's surname was Zhuang, and his name was Mohan. There were no servants in the room, nor was there a page boy. Only the old man, wearing a loose robe, continued to copy. Occasionally, he would frown and stare at the paper, flipping through the pages beside him, as if looking for some sort of confirmation. Compared to last year in the kingdom of Qing, Zhuang Mohan's spirit seemed to be much worse. Although his silver hair was still tightly bound, the age spots on his cheeks had become more pronounced, revealing some sort of inauspicious sign. Fan Xian did not want to disturb him, so he quietly walked behind him and cast his gaze on the table. He was surprised to find that on the table was the Banxian's High Poetry Collection from Dombo Bookstore, and on the margins of the poetry collection, who knew how many notes had been written? Could it be that this master of literature was writing notes for the poetry collection he had memorized? Zhuang Mohan's withered finger pointed at the second half of the line in the collection. Those who have seen the ocean cannot be water. Those who have not seen Mount Wu are not clouds. He kept tapping the page, his lips slightly parted, and with some pain he said, "It doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. There is only the beauty of words. The second half of the line doesn't make sense, it really doesn't make sense. Tell me, what does it mean?" After a moment of silence, Fan Xian's gentle voice rang out. Mount Wu is a sacred mountain in the extreme south. It is surrounded by clouds all year round, clouds at dawn, and rain at dusk. Anyone who has seen this scenery and this cloud will not be bothered to look at any other white fog in the world. These two words are the second half of the line, purely speaking of emotional loyalty. So that's how it is. Zhuang Mohan smiled bitterly and pointed at a thick book in the corner of the large table. Of course I could guess what it meant, but I couldn't find it. Flipping through this book, I couldn't find the cloudy Mount Wu, so it is a sacred mountain in the extreme south. No wonder I didn't know about it. Fan Xian saw that Zhuang Mohan did not suspect that he was making things up, and knew that this old man was a very gentle and tolerant person. So he smiled and stepped forward to grind the ink. He watched as Zhuang Mohan copied his explanation into the blank spaces of the book in small, meticulous characters. Zhuang Mohan's regular script was famous throughout the world, and its purity was second to none. But looking at it today, Fan Xian could not help but sigh. The old man's hands were trembling a little. The Prince of Qin used to hold banquets and drink wine, without restraint. What's the story behind this? Zhuang Mohan did not look at him, and continued to ask. Fan Xian felt awkward. When he was publishing the poetry anthology, he had specifically deleted Li Bai's, bringing in the wine. Why was this old man asking him? Zhuang Mohan sighed. Ever since I was a child, I have a photographic memory. I can't help but be proud of myself. That day, you recited poetry like a river, and I couldn't help but feel a little hurt. The old man laughed at himself. But it was thanks to this ability that I could remember so many of your poems. Later, when the Banxian's High Poetry Anthology was published, I found that many of them were missing. I don't know what you were thinking, child. Hearing Zhuang Mohan call him child, Fan Xian felt a strange feeling in his heart. He coughed twice and explained. The Prince of Qin was a prince with the surname Chao. He once held a banquet in Pingguang. A prince with the surname Chao. Zhuang Mohan raised his head. His cloudy eyes carried a trace of self-confidence. But, for 1,000 years, there has never been a royal family with the surname Chao. Fan Xian sighed in his heart and tried to persuade him. I'm just spouting nonsense. You don't have to worry about it. That won't do. Zhuang Mohan was stubborn in certain areas. He flipped through all the poems he had written by hand and pointed to one of them. In the middle is little Xie Yukingfa. Who is this little Xie? Fan Xian's face alternated between green and white. After a while he replied, Little Xie was a scholar who wrote stories. Although his writings were crude and could not be passed down, he had some fame in the marketplace. Then, after some time, when Fan Xian felt that he had run out of things to say and had lost interest in life, Zhuang Mohan finally sighed. He rubbed the corner of his eyes and threw his brush into the inkstone. He said with some sadness, I've run out of oil. I can't compare to when I was a scholar. After entering the room, The two of them did not greet each other. They threw themselves into this somewhat absurd task until now. Fan Xian rolled up his sleeves and bowed politely. Greetings, Master Zhuang. I don't know why you've summoned me here. The room became quiet. After a long time, Zhuang Mohan suddenly trembled, and with great difficulty, he bowed deeply to Fan Xian. Fan Xian was so shocked that he forgot to help him up. What kind of person was this old man? He was the Grand Master of the Emperor of Northern Qi. Why would he come to pay his respects? Zhuang Mohan had already straightened up. His wrinkled face was full of smiles. It's been a year since we met last year in the kingdom of Qing. I've always been virtuous. Last year, I framed Master Fan in the kingdom of Qing, and I've felt uneasy ever since. I've asked you to come here today to make amends. Fan Xian was silent. Of course, he knew that Zhuang Mohan had accepted the eldest princess's request. He had given up decades of face and traveled thousands of miles to the south to be a villain. It was all for the sake of Shaoan's release. This was brotherly love, what Fan Xian lacked the most. Shaoan is dead. Fan Xian looked at the old man in front of him, who had suddenly become much thinner in the past year. His thin lips parted slightly, and these 4 words came out. Zhuang Mohan looked at him with a smile, but said nothing. Fan Xian also smiled, knowing that he was being unnecessary. After all, Zhuang Mohan was an old Taoist who had been in the world for decades. He had deep roots in the kingdom of Northern Qi. How could he not know of this major event? Everyone has to die. Zhuang Mohan's words seemed to be for himself to hear, but also seemed to be for Fan Xian to hear. So if you live, you must live well. The way my brother has lived is meaningless. He killed countless people, and in the end he ended up like this. Fan Xian didn't quite agree with this saying. In this world, murder and arson are golden belts. Repairing bridges and paving roads leaves no corpses. Zhuang Mohan shook his head. Don't be that kind of person. It wasn't that he couldn't, but that he didn't want to. If any outsider were to stand in this room and hear the conversation between Zhuang Mohan and Fan Xian, and see their natural and unpretentious expressions, they would feel a little strange. The difference in life experience between these two people was too great, and the only time they had met was because of a conspiracy. Yet these two people could use the most direct words to express their attitudes. Perhaps this was the so-called power of books. Why not? There was a chill between Fan Xian's brows. I'm very confident. Zhuang Mohan suddenly laughed, but there was a deep sadness hidden in his smile. I'm confident that I'm much happier than my brother. Fan Xian stared into his eyes. But you should know that if it weren't for Shaoan, perhaps you would never have obtained the position you have today. Zhuang Mohan stared back at him. But you still don't know. When death gradually approaches, you will realize that power, status, and wealth are all just fleeting clouds. Fan Xian replied calmly and stubbornly. No, when death comes, perhaps you will regret this life. You haven't experienced anything. You haven't enjoyed anything. You only already have something in this life that normal people will never be able to have. That is why when Hua Lao passed away, you had some thoughts. Zhuang Mohan shook his head helplessly. You are still young. You have never smelled the deepening smell of death around you day after day. How would you know what you will think when the time comes? I know. Fan Xian repeated somewhat mechanically. Believe me, I know that feeling. Zhuang Mohan seemed to be a little tired, and he didn't want to continue this topic. He changed the subject. I didn't think that the person who could write such a rebellious text as Story of the Stone would still be my own filthy work. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. I also didn't think that such a thing as a rumor could fly faster than a bird. Zhuang Mohan's eyes suddenly revealed a trace of concern. Master Fan, when you return home, you must be careful. Story of the Stone has many taboos. Fan Xian was silent. He also knew this, but in his youth he had been frivolous. He couldn't bear to lose the opportunity for those words to appear in this world, so he had casually written them. Now that he was in officialdom, he naturally understood that if someone wanted to find innuendo in them, it would be all too easy. Furthermore, there was a coincidence in this matter that shocked even Fan Xian, so he had no choice but to be cautious. It was a pity that the Emperor of Northern Qi was also a fan of romance, so this matter couldn't be hidden any longer. But Zhuang Mohan shouldn't be so concerned about him. This was what Fan Xian was puzzled about. Zhuang Mohan seemed to guess what he was thinking. He smiled. Master Fan, I invited you here today not only to apologize for my selfishness, but also to thank you. Thank you, Fan Xian frowned. He didn't think that Zhuang Mohan knew that he had extended Shaoan's life by a day. I thank you on behalf of all the scholars in the world. Zhuang Mohan looked at him with a smile. Master Fan, when you first entered the Overwatch Council, you exposed the fraud of the Kingdom of Qing's imperial examinations. This matter affected the world, and even His Majesty wanted to reform the imperial examinations. Master's actions will benefit many poor scholars. Perhaps you do not think much of me, but on behalf of all the scholars of the world, I must thank you. Fan Xian's lips curled up in a self-deprecating smile. Exposing fraud? That's the business of scholars. Is there a need for thanks? But Zhuang Mohan did not smile. His turbid eyes were a little lifeless. He had not done much to bring Shaoan back to the country this time. The most important thing was that he did not want this matter to cause the entire court to descend into chaos. But he knew that this world was not made up entirely of scholars. There were politicians, schemers, and martial artists. Their methods of handling matters were sometimes more direct and wilder. He looked at Fan Xian. He was about to say something. But then he remembered that this was, after all, Northern Qi's internal affairs. There was no need to say anything to him. After a long time, Fan Xian left the courtyard where Zhuang Mohan lived. He never returned for the rest of his life. Summer arrived. Although the hottest days of the year should have long since passed, Northern Qi was located in the northeast of the continent. Autumn was particularly hot and humid, and the drizzling rain that was common in late spring and early summer had long since disappeared. Only the bright, white sun hung overhead, frivolously and fiercely forcing people to take off their clothes until they couldn't. Outside the southern gate of Shangjing, a bright yellow carriage disappeared through the gate, and the old greenish-gray city wall immediately became the most conspicuous thing in the eyes of the people outside the city. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes as he looked in that direction. He felt uneasy. The emperor had personally come to see off the Qing diplomatic mission. This was completely against the rules. No matter how the Northern Qi officials tried to dissuade him, they couldn't stop him. So they had no choice but to send a large number of high-ranking officials and powerful officials. Even the Grand Tutor had come out of the city to see them off, giving the Qing diplomatic mission enough face. Earlier, the emperor and Fan Xian had been holding hands and chatting about everyday things, constantly thinking about the story of the stone and the like. Who knew how many gazes they had attracted? With great difficulty, they had finally managed to get this somewhat eccentric emperor to leave. Outside the city were only the officials of Northern Qi and the ceremonial guards. Fan Xian glanced around and saw Wei Hua, but he did not see Chang Ningho or Shen Zhong. He felt his back was drenched. He didn't know if it was because of the emperor's fright or the sun. The auspicious hour had not yet arrived, so the diplomatic mission could not leave. He looked at the most magnificent carriage in front of the group. The great princess of Northern Qi was in it. He had only glanced at her from a distance. He could vaguely see that she was a beautiful noble, but he didn't know what her personality was like. But Fan Xian wasn't worried about the return trip. After the incident with Haitang, Fan Xian was more confident in his ability to get along with women. A cool breeze swept past, and Fan Xian immediately relaxed. He tugged at the buttons on his clothes, thinking, how could there be such a gentle breeze in this terrible weather? He turned his head and, as expected, Wang Qinian was next to him, waving his fan in a fawning manner. His face was full of sadness and reluctance. Fan Xian couldn't help but burst out laughing. It's only been a year. Why are you so sad? I'll take care of your wife and children. Don't worry. With the diplomatic mission leaving, Yan Bingyan naturally had to follow them back home. As a result, the Overwatch Council of Qing's spy network in Northern Qi was suddenly without a leader. So the Overwatch Council decided to have Wang Qinian stay in Shangjing as the minister of the Grand Herald Temple of Qing's permanent residence in Northern Qi. He would temporarily take charge of matters in the north, and in half a year, the council would secretly send officials to take over. As commissioner, Fan Xian's status in the council was special. Matters like this did not need to go through the formalities of the yamen in the capital, so it was easily settled. But Wang Qinian hadn't expected that he would not be returning with the diplomatic mission. He couldn't help but feel uneasy and disappointed. Although he knew that this experience would greatly benefit his future promotion, he still felt a little uneasy. Sir, if I don't listen to you for a day, I feel uneasy all over. Wang Qinian looked at Fan Xian reluctantly. Fan Xian smiled. Don't get into conflict with Northern Qi. Be wise and play it safe. In a year's time, I'll welcome you in the capital. In truth, he was used to having such a sidekick at his side. Most importantly, Wang Qinian was his only trusted aide in the council. Unfortunately, because he had to prepare to deal with the eldest princess's money channel, he had no choice but to stay in Northern Qi. While they were talking, a horse suddenly came out of the city gate. The person on the horse was not an official, but was dressed like a servant. He couldn't help but attract the attention of the officials. They thought to themselves, why would the yamen of the 9 cities of Shangjing let a commoner come here? Fan Xian's eyes were sharp, and he saw that the face of the Grand Tutor, who stood at the head of the group, darkened, and his eyes showed sorrow. The horse rode directly to the front of the group, and the servant on the horse fell off. With a sobbing voice, he moved closer to the Grand Tutor and said something. He handed the Grand Tutor a roll of cloth, and then pointed to the city gate behind them. The Grand Tutor's body swayed. He didn't know what had happened, but he looked at the carriage slowly approaching from the city gate, and shook his head sorrowfully. He turned his head to glance at Fan Xian, but his eyes were filled with surprise. He took a deep breath, and then walked toward Fan Xian. Fan Xian didn't know what had happened. He nervously dismounted and went to greet him. He accepted the roll of cloth the Grand Tutor handed him, and nervously opened it. He saw that it was a collection of poems. On the pages were a few words written in slightly meandering old handwriting. Bangxian's High Poetry Collection, Notes by Lao Zhuang. The Grand Tutor looked at the silent Fan Xian with mixed feelings and said, "This was given to you by Sir." Speaking to this point, his tone couldn't help but carry a deep sorrow and heaviness. Sir Zhuang has gone. Chapter 253. Fan Xian held the scroll in his hand, not knowing what to say for a moment. He had not expected his meeting with Zhuang Mohan the night before to be his last. That night, he had discovered that Zhuang Mohan was not as energetic as he had been the previous year. But he had not expected the leader of the literary world to so abruptly bid farewell to the world. Zhuang Mohan's last words were to hand over this book, the result of his last work, to Fan Xian. The meaning hidden within was not simple. At this time, the officials who were seeing Fan Xian off outside Shangjing gradually learned of this shocking news. A sense of grief began to fill the air, and more Northern Qi officials turned their gazes to Fan Xian. Their gazes were vigilant, resentful and suspicious. Fan Xian understood what the Northern Qi people were thinking. Zhuang Mohan's only stain in his life was his own. But now that he was gone, Fan Xian felt a little sad, and he subconsciously filtered out all the complicated gazes. As he was thinking, the carriage at the city gate finally arrived. Under the gazes of the officials, it came to the back of the diplomatic mission's convoy. The wood of the carriage was slightly deformed, and it creaked noisily. One could imagine that the carriage must have been carrying something very heavy. The servant who had come to deliver the news led Fan Xian to the carriage. In a trembling voice he said, "Master Fan, the old master has ordered that you take this carriage back to the south and preserve it well." The crowd had not yet recovered from the shock of Zhuang Mohan's death. Seeing this scene, they could not help but feel sad. They could not help but be curious as to what Zhuang Mohan had wanted to give Fan Xian before he died. The sun was glaring. Fan Xian squinted and lifted the thick curtain of the carriage, but he could not help but be dazzled by the contents inside. Inside the books were beauties, inside the books were houses of gold, and inside the books were grains of millet. Although there were no beauties or jewels in the carriage, Fan Xian was still surprised and moved. It was an entire carriage full of books, presumably Zhuang Mohan's life's collection. Given the old man's status, he did not need to flip through the books to guess that they were rare and unique. The servant respectfully handed over a booklet and said, "Master Fan, this is the list of books compiled by the master himself. Behind it are the precautions for preserving books." Fan Xian sighed and put down the curtain. He picked up the book and read it carefully. Although printing had made great progress, printing books was still a very impressive thing, not to mention an entire carriage. Thinking of the old man's act of gifting a book to him, he couldn't help but feel touched. At this moment, he heard the servant say sorrowfully, "Master gifted a book to you, please take good care of it." Fan Xian knew that this family member had said this on his own initiative, but he still raised his hands and bowed sincerely. Solemnly he said, "Brother, please do not worry. Even if I die, these books will continue to be passed down in this world." By now, the Northern Qi officials had gathered around. They could clearly see that the carriage was piled with books. These officials had all come from the imperial examinations, so how could they not know the value of this carriage full of books? None of them had expected that Master Zhuang, on his deathbed, would give these precious books, which he had spent his entire life studying, to the officials of the southern court. They could not help but feel shocked and a little jealous. The Grand Tutor, however, understood his master's intentions and could not help but sigh. Gifting the books was only an act. Zhuang Mohan used this action to show his attitude. This was not just a simple gift, but a symbolic inheritance. No matter how proud the civil officials of Northern Qi were, from now on, they could no longer ignore Fan Xian's existence. And Fan Xian's position in the hearts of the world's scholars had finally been acknowledged in a certain ceremony. Fan Xian turned his head to look at the Grand Tutor and said sincerely, "It is only right that I return to the city to pay my respects. Only then will I be at ease." The Grand Tutor could not hide the sorrow in his eyes. Right now, all he wanted was to return to the city to pay his respects, and he did not have time to think about it. In addition, Fan Xian had taken the initiative to offer his respects, which comforted him, so he agreed. Unexpectedly, Wei Hua, the vice minister of the office of the Grand Herald, approached the two of them. He bowed and said in a deep voice, "The world mourns Master's passing. But Master Fan, the diplomatic mission's schedule has been set, and the ceremonial guards have been raised. We cannot return to the city." After a moment of silence, Fan Xian raised his eyes to look at the greenish-gray walls of Shangjing. It was as if he could see a faint purple light floating in the sky above. He tidied up his clothes and bowed deeply in the direction of the city. He bowed all the way to the ground, performing the etiquette of an outer sect disciple. The Grand Tutor was slightly surprised. He knew that Fan Xian's disciples' bow was enough to put an end to last year's storm, and that his act of respect had cemented Master Zhuang's monument. He felt a little comforted and returned the bow. The cannon sounded, but it was unclear whether it was a send-off or a call for the soul. Shredded paper flew everywhere, and the slightly pungent smell of smoke dissipated in a flash, like the impermanence of this world. The diplomatic mission's carriages moved slowly, following the road to the west. Behind the carriages, the officials of Northern Qi watched as the southern carriages left, and as the heavy carriage carrying books followed them. They could not help but sigh in unison. Straightening their clothes, they went back to their manners to change, and hurried to Master Zhuang's manor. Presumably, the Empress Dowager and His Majesty had already arrived, and no one dared to tarry. The Grand Tutor and the scholars, who had been personally taught by Zhuang Mohan, were crying so hard they almost fainted. The group of carriages continued forward. When the majestic city walls of Shangjing gradually disappeared into the green mountains and dense forests, they arrived at the first relay station outside of Shangjing. According to the rules, a large group of people from the diplomatic corps returning home, and the bridal party, had to settle here for the night, before continuing on their journey the next day. Fan Xian slowly dismounted from his horse and walked forward. As he passed by the carriage carrying books, he could not help but turn his head to look at it, but he resisted the urge to get on. He walked up to the luxurious carriage, painted gold and painted red, and bowed. "We have arrived at the courier station," he said respectfully. "Princess, please take a rest." After some time, a faint voice came from within the carriage. "Sir, please help yourself. I would like to sit alone for a while." This was the first time Fan Xian had heard the great princess's voice. It sounded slightly hoarse, and he could not help but feel a little strange. Then he saw the curtain of the carriage lift, and a palace maid stepped out, her eyes red. She walked to his side and said quietly, "Her Highness is not feeling well. Sir Fan, please wait a moment." Fan Xian asked with concern. Her Highness is of noble birth, and naturally cannot endure such a long journey. It is only right for her to rest. The palace maid looked at Fan Xian's handsome face, and for some reason, she felt an inexplicable sense of trust in him. She said quietly, "The princess was once taught by Master Zhuang. Today she has received this news, so she is a little sad." Fan Xian finally understood, and his gaze toward the carriage carried a trace of sympathy. It seemed that the princess was not an arrogant and willful person, and that she would not stop crying out of gratitude for her teacher's kindness. But Zhuang Mohan had passed away in the city, and the princess was in the carriage, and could not pay her respects. It was truly a sad thing to be in the royal family. He sighed. Perhaps he was thinking of his own past. He gave the palace maid a few instructions, then summoned the tiger guards and the core members of the diplomatic mission, and made arrangements. Only then did he enter the courier station alone. The courier station knew that the wedding procession and the diplomatic mission would be passing through, and so it had long since been cleaned up. All kinds of equipment were handled according to the rules of the palace. After a brief inspection, Fan Xian passed through the main room and quietly exited through the back door. His figure disappeared behind the tall beams behind the courier station. After a while, most of the people had entered the courier station, and the officials sent by the Ministry of Rights were very busy. Naturally, no one noticed where Fan Xian had gone. Outside the courier station, there were 2 carriages with no one alighted. One was the carriage of the eldest princess. Everyone knew that Her Highness was grieving, and naturally did not dare to disturb her. As for the officials of Northern Qi, in the other carriage was the handsome demon outside, and they paid even less attention to him. Only the Tiger Guards and Overwatch Council officials that Fan Xian had specifically left behind guarded the 2 carriages vigilantly. A small corner of the curtain of the second carriage was lifted, and an incomparably pale and cold hand beckoned. The Overwatch Council official next to the carriage immediately walked over. He leaned against the corner of the curtain and asked in a low voice, "Sir Yen, what are your orders?" Through the corner of the curtain, Yen Bingyun's handsome but exceptionally cold face appeared. "Where did you go, sir?" he asked quietly. In the diplomatic mission, there was only one person whom he could call sir. Fan Xian. The Overwatch Council official looked at him and said in a low voice, "I do not know." Yen Bingyun frowned, as if there was something he could not say. After hesitating for a while, he finally said quietly, "Along the way, has there been a woman who likes to wear light blue clothes following the carriages? She likes to ride a big red horse." The Overwatch Council official shook his head. Yen Bingyun's face showed no expression. He put down the curtain and confirmed that Lady Shen had not risked coming to see him. His mood relaxed a little, but for some reason after relaxing he felt a little gloomy. Outside the sorghum field was a lonely pavilion. Next to the pavilion was an old road that had been abandoned for many years. A carriage was parked on the road, and 2 girls stood inside. A gust of wind blew past, rustling the sorghum field. Fan Xian walked out and slowly walked into the pavilion. His eyes were gentle as he looked at the incomparably plump girl. He said quietly, "Who would have thought that after entering Shangjing, the only time we could really talk would be when we were about to leave?" Si Lily bowed slightly to him. Her voice trembled slightly. "Greetings, sir." Fan Xian did not continue speaking. He only glanced at Haitang, who was standing to the side. Haitang smiled and put her hands in her pockets. The tip of her foot touched the cracked ground beneath the pavilion, and she floated away, leaving the pavilion to the strange couple. As soon as Haitang left the pavilion, the gentleness on Fan Xian's face disappeared without a trace. He looked at Si Lily seriously. "After entering the palace, you must be careful. The Empress Dowager is not a simple character. It will not be easy to hide from her." Si Lily looked at him, and a trace of tenderness gradually appeared in her eyes. She said softly, You just want me to be careful. Nothing else? Fan Xian smiled, but did not go forward to hug her frail shoulders. Since you insist on staying in Northern Qi, why do you want to soften my heart now? Do you women find it fun to provoke us filthy things? Si Lily smiled lightly. She did not look as weak as she had in front of Haidang. Isn't that the case, sir? Although I insist on staying in Northern Qi, you spoke first. Are you afraid that I will ask you to take me back to the capital? A trace of ridicule flashed in Fan Xian's eyes. Perhaps you will one day become the mistress of the Northern Qi harem. Why bother hanging around with people like me? Si Lily also laughed. To have a place to stay in the palace is good enough. How could I dare hope for more? Fan Xian shook his head and suddenly said, Lily, you are different from other women in the world. Si Lily made an "oh" sound, and then responded calmly. Perhaps it is because I have traveled the world since I was young, and have been to many places. Compared to those women who stay in their houses all day embroider and compose poems, I am a bit more presumptuous. Fan Xian was silent. He knew that what she said made sense. In today's world, ordinary women could only sit at home. Few had the experience Si Lily had, and the freedom Haitang had. He turned his head to look in the direction Haitang had disappeared. In a serious tone he said, I believe in your ability, but I must warn you not to underestimate those who seem old and muddle-headed. The atmosphere in the pavilion seemed to freeze. After a long time, Si Lily bowed deeply and lowered her head. A few strands of her fine black hair danced in the wind. In a soft voice she said, Perhaps you don't believe me, but Lily really likes to talk with you, just like in the carriage when we came here. Fan Xian looked at her. He didn't know how much of what she said was true, and how much was false. Si Lily smiled. Her beautiful face looked incomparably charming. Sir, I am very grateful that you cured me of the poison on the way. What you said is true. I am not Chen Pingping, Fan Xian said. I believe that even if there is a conflict of interest, it can be resolved in a more gentle way. And I do not wish for the Emperor of Northern Qi to be poisoned because of you. Of course, now it seems that Chen Pingping's plan had no hope of success from the beginning. Si Lily's cheeks reddened. She knew that the man who was closest to her had already guessed something. Fan Xian continued in a quiet voice. You will live in the palace from now on. Your status will rise. No matter how powerful the Overwatch Council is, they will not be able to control you. So whether or not the agreement between us will be effective depends on us. Si Lily said seriously, Sir, please do not worry. Fan Xian looked at the beautiful girl's brow, and suddenly felt a little absent-minded. After a while he said, Wait for news in the north. Be careful. I believe it won't be long before someone helps you avenge your family. Si Lily suddenly raised her head, and looked at Fan Xian in disbelief. Fan Xian ignored the surprise in her eyes. He took a piece of paper from his sleeve, and gave it to her. Contact me through this person. After you memorize it, destroy it. Fan Xian suddenly smiled. I can allow you to abandon the agreement between us, but I will not accept you betraying me. This contact is a one-way street. Even if you sell him to Northern Qi, he will not be of any use, so it is best that you do not take risks. Seeing the young man's strange sweet smile, Si Lily's heart trembled. She didn't know why she was afraid, but she quickly nodded. Also if. Fan Xian was silent for a while, then suddenly said, If there comes a day when you do not want to stay in the Northern Qi Palace, let me know. I will take care of it. Thank you, sir. Si Lily weakly bowed her head in thanks. Her thanks finally revealed a glimmer of sincerity and reluctance. She knew that after this thanks, she would have to leave. With a slightly sad expression she said, After this farewell, I do not know when we will meet again. Every time I think about it, I cannot help but feel my heart break. After saying this, Si Lily resolutely turned and left the pavilion, leaving behind Fan Xian, who was frowning deeply, still thinking about the meaning hidden in the words heartbreak. Watching the carriage gradually leave along the abandoned ancient road, Fan Xian's face showed no expression, but he sighed in the depths of his heart. He then punched a pillar of the pavilion with a bang. The pavilion had been in disrepair for a long time, and was already tottering on the verge of collapse. Now that Fan Xian had punched it, it creaked. A figure floated down from the pavilion. Who else could it be but Haitang? Haitang gently landed next to Fan Xian and smiled bitterly. Duo did not overhear anything. If you had, Fan Xian said, I would have become mute. Haitang smiled. Master Fan, you are about to leave Northern Qi. I do not know when we will meet again. Fan Xian thought of his sister back home in the capital and couldn't help but sigh. I do not think it will be long. Where did your illustrious teacher go? He suddenly changed the subject. I came to Northern Qi, but I did not pay a visit to this great grandmaster. It is truly a pity. Haitang thought for a moment and decided not to hide this matter. She quietly said, 3 days before the Southern Dynasty's diplomatic mission entered the capital, teacher received a piece of wood and left Shangjing. No one knows where he went, including the Empress Dowager and me. In these days in Shangjing, you helped me hide many things. Fan Xian looked at the lonely tree at the end of the ancient road. I truly must thank you for that. So, regarding the matter of goods heading north, I am currently discussing it with Chang Ningho and Shenzhong. If that emperor of yours needs to borrow money from me, he must get rid of Shenzhong. That man looks ordinary, but he is actually a very powerful person. Haitang was silent for a moment then said, This is a secret between the two of us. Fan Xian looked at her incomparably bright eyes and said, Word by word. In this world, other than my brother-in-law, I have rarely seen a pure fool. How many people do you think the secret between us can be hidden from? Duo, on this trip to Northern Qi, you have helped me a great deal, both openly and secretly. Don't think that senior brother of yours did not notice. Haitang frowned. What are you trying to say? Fan Xian smiled. What I want to say is, since you and the emperor are preparing to escape from the shadow of the Empress Dowager, then you cannot just count on the struggles of the court, and you cannot count on an outsider like me to provide you with funds. After all, Northern Qi is a great power. If you want to completely control it, it will take years. Haitang smiled. I think Master Fan might have misunderstood something. Oh. Fan Xian smiled. What are you worried about? Haitang seemed to be talking about a different topic. I am a good student who respects his teacher. Fan Xian suddenly said. Zhuang Mohan is dead. Zhuang Mohan had students all over the world, and was revered by all. Aside from the incident last year, there was nothing to nitpick about his moral writings. Even Haitang greatly respected this old man. But she had been waiting for the diplomatic mission in the suburbs of the capital, so she did not know of his passing. Now that she heard the news, her face revealed a trace of shock and sorrow, and she did not know what to say. For a moment, there was a sense of desolation in the pavilion. After a long time, it was Fan Xian who broke the silence. Shaowen is dead. Zhuang Mohan is dead. All the great figures of the past will gradually grow old and die. Even if you are a good student who respects his teacher, I think you should be prepared for that day. Haitang stared into his eyes. Master, you seem to be hinting at something. Fan Xian smiled. I can understand the strong desire of a young man to be the master of his own house. Haitang smiled, slightly dispelling the sadness she felt after hearing of Master Zhuang's death. Why is it that when so many heavy things come out of your mouth, they seem so much lighter? Why is it that when so many dark things come out of your mouth, they immediately become incomparably bright? Because the dark night gave us black eyes, and I want to use them to find the light. Haitang tilted her head slightly. I remember you saying that you want to use it to roll your eyes at the world. The world, Fan Xian said. This world is theirs and it is also ours. But in the end, it is ours. The thick clouds in the sky floated over, completely covering the sun. But the sun was too strong. Even so, it could not hide the bright red light that seeped through the edges of the clouds. It was as if a fairy had used her skillful hands to embroider a golden border. A gust of wind blew over from the plains, passing through the ancient path on the ground and the pavilion. Fan Xian looked at Haitang. Duo, thank you for your help these past few days. Haitang finally took her hands out of the large pockets of her coarse clothes. Somewhat unnaturally, she curtsied like an ordinary girl. Master Fan is too polite. Below the pavilion, Fan Xian stepped forward and pulled her into his arms for a hug. For some reason, Even with Haitong's extremely high level of cultivation, she was unable to avoid his hug. Letting go immediately, he revealed a sincere smile. To tell you the truth, if you and I could really become friends, I think it would be a very good thing. Haitong gently tidied up the black hair at the corner of her forehead. Her ordinary face did not show the slightest bit of embarrassment or unease, because of the extremely intimate hug. Smiling, she said, "Likewise." Haitong stood under the dilapidated pavilion, beside the ancient path, watching Fan Xian's figure disappear into the distance. She could not help but tilt her head slightly, thinking back to her days in Shangjing. A trace of a smile rose to the corners of her lips. She thought to herself that this young master of the southern court was indeed an extremely interesting person, with extremely keen eyes. Presumably, when he returned to the kingdom of Qing, there would be some very subtle changes in the south. She sighed, dispelling the grief that had arisen from Zhuang Mohan's passing. Only then did she remember that she had ultimately forgotten one thing. Did the Haitong Poetry Society and Story of the Stone have anything to do with her? She unconsciously reached out to tighten the floral scarf on her head, but found that she touched nothing but air. She immediately reacted, and could not help but feel a slight heat on her face. Only now did she realize that no matter how well she had hidden it, she had still been a little nervous during the hug. She had not even noticed that the little thief had stolen her floral scarf. Fan Xian was currently walking through the tall sorghum. Occasionally, branches would hit his face and shatter, but there was a trace of a happy and pure smile on his face. His trip to northern Qi had finally come to a relatively satisfactory conclusion, and after his rebirth, he had met some interesting people, such as Yan Bingyan, that block of ice, and Haitong, that seemingly tacky but actually delicate flower. Aside from some conflicts of interest and differences in philosophy, he very much enjoyed talking to Haitong. The emperor also wanted to have a son. He also wanted to eat meat. Kripelchen also wanted to go to the latrine, and Fan Xian also wanted to have friends. He tucked the floral scarf in his hand into his clothes, and pushed aside the plants in front of him. Looking at the faint green smoke rising from the relay station in the distance, he lightly hummed, "Throw, throw, throw the handkerchief." Chapter 254. The Fog of the North Sea chapter ended. I was actually a little nervous when I wrote it, because it was a new situation, new characters, past stories, and current thoughts. The overall quality was passable. One of the most important topics in this chapter was metabolism. Northern Qi was the successor of Northern Wei, the center of the old era. Most of the outstanding characters of that time were in this country, and these people gradually grew old and died in these 99 chapters. Characters like the Emperor and Haitong, although still young, would eventually stand on the stage. I almost forgot to say that for me, the thing I was most proud of about this chapter was that it happened to end at the end of the 99 chapters, exactly as planned. And for Fan Xian, he not only had to follow in the footsteps of his predecessors, he had to follow in the footsteps of his predecessors. He had to follow in the footsteps of Zhuang Mohan, and stand in the footsteps of Shaoan. More importantly, after entering the cave, he had a clearer understanding of his predecessors, and that predecessor's affairs, and he had to gradually break away from that omnipresent feeling of encirclement. Fan Xian could only be the Fan Xian who was disgusted. Of course, the so-called self-mastery did not mean that he would not inherit. He had to do something himself, to surpass something. That was too tiring, and I would not write it like that. Aside from the core ideology of the year of Qingyu, the main objective was to make Fan Xian the most handsome second generation in all of the novels. One of my life fantasies was to suddenly inherit a distant relative's fortune, which was worth tens of billions of dollars. Did anyone not want that? Sigh, that could only mean that I was indeed very vulgar. As for what the core ideology was, I had originally planned to write the third book before concluding it, but I'll say it now. I planned to write 3 novels, and the first one was already finished. The Vermilion Bird Chronicles was about, a bad life is better than a good death. The second book of the year of Qingyu was about, living is a very rare thing, so one should live happily. The third book was about, how to live, a story about seeking life in the midst of death. It was a very nonsensical 3 principles, but sometimes nonsense was actually very reasonable. The Year of Qing Yu was a popular book, and there was no profound meaning to it. The key was to tell the story. I would not purposely use words, because words were not concise. If I did, it would be like an embroidered toilet seat. I also would not purposely ask for meaning, because Fan Xian was not Su Sanduo. He was a person with a very clear goal. The 3 representatives of the first volume had already been very clear. However, there would always be some sour and sweet emotions in the words. That could not be helped. Humans are emotional creatures, and it was inevitable that I would be biased towards certain characters and have some feelings for them. What I had was a passionate heart and the sincerity of telling a story. I had to make sure to update every day, so I didn't have time to take a nap in between. There would always be various things around me, especially after I reached the threshold of 30. I suddenly realized that there were many things in life that I had to take care of. I was originally a person with a lot of time, but now I inevitably felt that I didn't have enough time. However, these were all private matters, so I didn't intend to talk about them here and affect everyone's reading. Too unreasonable, too unreasonable. I cupped my hands and walked off the stage. Write one last sentence. Transmigrating was a very cool thing. I decided that if I had the chance in the future, I would transmigrate again. That time, I would transmigrate to a real dynasty. At worst, I would be the first to discover tobacco, chili, and white wine. As long as I had these 3 things in my life, what could I not bear? Chapter 255. It was early autumn, and above the plains to the north of the capital of the Kingdom of Qing, a patch of clouds appeared and disappeared. The people working in the fields did not raise their heads. They had no interest in watching the beautiful tricks the heavens played with the shape of the clouds and the refraction of the sun. They just wanted to harvest the golden crops before the rain cloud floated over. There had been a lot of rain this year. It was said that the river in the south had swollen violently, but for the people living in the north, the safety of the riverbanks had nothing to do with them. They were more worried about whether or not this damned rain would delay the harvest of the year. Occasionally, a few fat field mice would fearlessly pass under the feet of the farmers, snatching the scattered grains in the fields. The scythes in the farmers' hands were too lazy to deal with these scourges. They focused on harvesting the grains. In the endless rice fields on both sides of the official road, the sounds of harvesting gradually merged into one, forming a neat and beautiful sound that could make anyone who heard it feel a certain sense of satisfaction. The farmers, who were bare-chested, were facing the yellow soil with their backs to the sky, showing the small cuts made by the leaves on their bodies to the cold sky. However, they did not notice that there was a long line of carriages on the official road that seemed to have no end in sight, moving slowly toward them. The Kingdom of Qing's diplomatic mission to northern Qi had finally fulfilled its promise of leaving in spring and returning in autumn. They had hurried back to their homeland in the middle of September, but the returning carriages were even larger than the ones that had left. Other than the gifts that northern Qi had given in return to show their sincerity, there were also many officials and ceremonial guards. It was enough to show the importance that the northern Qi court placed on the princess's marriage. After all, this was the first marriage between the 2 countries. No one knew what kind of change this kind of diplomatic relationship would bring to the continent, which had just experienced 20 years of peace. Other than the magnificent carriage that the great princess of northern Qi was in, there was another carriage in the long line of carriages that was more eye-catching. Regardless of whether it was compared to the colorful carriages of northern Qi or the black carriages of the Qing court, this carriage appeared much more wretched. Although the horses pulling the carriage were also fine horses, even the horses' heads swayed weakly. The members of the diplomatic mission knew that it was because the carriage was too heavy. On top of it were the books that Zhuang Mohan of northern Qi had given to the head envoy, Fan Xian, before he died. The books looked unremarkable, but they were much heavier than the eldest princess dowry. Every time they saw the carriage, many of the members of the diplomatic mission could not help but feel a sense of respect. It was not only because of Sir Fan's radiant face, but also because of his scholarly style. Everyone knew that ever since they had passed through several small countries in the north and entered the border of Zhangzhou, Sir Fan had locked himself in the carriage, reading day and night. He was not even willing to come down to eat or rest. "I can't live like this anymore." Fan Xian sighed and put the book of poems from the previous dynasty back into the box behind him. The curtain of the carriage was blown shut by the wind, plunging the carriage into darkness. It was impossible to see the expression on his face, but from the sound of his voice, it was clear that Master Fan was not very willing to stay in the carriage and pretend to be a diligent literary master of the present age. The journey south had been smooth and peaceful. After the eldest princess of Northern Qi had shaken off the grief of Zhuang Mohan's death, she had regained the modesty and self-respect that a noble should have. She did not cause him any trouble. On the contrary, in the courier station, in the city guard's manor, Fan Xian was able to speak with the beautiful eldest princess occasionally. They chatted about more mundane matters, and it was to relieve the loneliness of the journey. Although he did not dare to be overly courteous as an official, talking to a girl was much better than talking to Gouda and the other cold-faced swordsman, or Yin Bingyin, that block of ice. But this situation finally ended after they passed Zhangzhou. It was not that Fan Xian did not dare speak to the eldest prince's future daughter-in-law upon returning to the kingdom of Qing. It was because there was suddenly one more person in the diplomatic mission, and that person's identity was a little special. Her background was a little strange, and she had an unclear relationship with one of the members of the diplomatic mission. That person had been staying in the eldest princess carriage, and Fan Xian did not want to see her crying every day. So he hid himself in the carriage, leaving the difficult problem to Yin Bingyin, Master Yin Jr. Along the way, there were reports from the Overwatch Council. Other than the few strange murder cases in the south that still had no clues, there was nothing special. No one thought that the most shocking news would come from the north. Shenzhong had died. On a rainy night, under the protection of 13 brocade guards, he had been killed by Shang Shanhu, a spear-wielding general of the military, in the middle of the street. The provost of the brocade guard, the head of Northern Qi's secret service after Xiao En, had died in such a cowardly manner. This seemingly absurd news had already been proven to be the truth. Fan Xian rubbed his temples and laughed bitterly. Thinking of Wang Qinyan's description in the report, he could not help but feel a little shocked. According to the intelligence report, on that rainy night, Shang Shanhu was clad in black armor from head to toe. He held a long spear in his hand as he galloped down the long street. With one strike of his spear, he beheaded Shenzhong, who was in the palanquin. With another sweep of his spear, he tore apart the bodies of the bodyguards around Shenzhong. It was only when he retracted his spear and galloped back to his residence that the rain on the long street seemed to dare to fall. Such a display of power was truly frightening. A peerless expert of the 9th level had used such a valiant method to directly tear apart all the conspiracies and schemes. He had used pure force to challenge the authority of the entire imperial court. Fan Xian had not expected Shang Shanhu to be such a tyrannical figure. He knew that he had still underestimated the iron-blooded nature of the military, trained on the battlefield. He could not help but feel his head ache even more. No matter how much he rubbed it, he could not alleviate it. After all, many people knew that he had played a disgraceful role in Xiaoen's escape. Even if Tan Wu had not shouted "Kill me, Fan Xian," before he killed himself, Shang Shanhu would still have blamed Xiaoen's death and the betrayal of the people of the south on Fan Xian's head. Fan Xian could only hope that Qing and Northern Qi would remain friends for generations, never to fight again, never to give Shang Shanhu a chance to face him on the battlefield. Of course, there were still many suspicious points about Shenzhong's death. After all, he was the head of the brocade guard. No matter how ruthless Shang Shanhu was, or how angry the military was, to kill him in the middle of the street was not an easy task. Furthermore, the reaction of the Northern Qi court seemed to confirm this point. After a night of silence in the palace, Shang Shanhu was placed under house arrest in the manor, and his title of nobility was taken away. Another edict shockingly pointed out the many crimes Shenzhong had committed over the years. Each stroke of the imperial edict threw the recently deceased Shenzhong into a vat of dirty water, making it impossible for him to rise again for the rest of his life. The Shen mansion was subsequently raided, and the brocade guard was purged. The military was proud and elated. Although the young emperor maintained his silence, it could be assumed that he was happy in his heart. This was because, through this incident, Shang Shanhu's resentment towards the royal family would lessen. However, a fierce tiger like Shang Shanhu was not an easy character to control. Just by looking at the fact that the palace still had Shang Shanhu imprisoned in the capital, one could tell that they were still having a headache over how to deal with him. Naturally, they could not kill him. No one wanted to bear the repercussions of the military. They could not let him go either. Who knew what would happen to him when he returned to the mountains? Fan Xian shook his head. He had not thought that after hearing his words, Haitang would act so quickly and so fiercely against Shenzhong. But after constructing the scene of Shang Shanhu killing Shenzhong in the rainy night in his mind, Fan Xian, who should have been worried about his own safety, felt an inexplicable sense of pleasure and admiration. Ruthless and decisive, quick to repay kindness and enmity, when Shang Shanhu slowly raised his black spear on the horse, ready to reap Shenzhong's life, there was no longer a trace of reverence in his eyes. That night rain on the long street, how arrogant was it? He lifted the curtain of the carriage and jumped out without calling for the driver to stop. Standing on the official road, he waved his hand to disperse the oncoming yellow wind. Looking at the farmers laboring on both sides of the road, his heart stirred. He threw all the matters of the north to the back of his mind. Those matters could no longer affect him, and he could not affect them for the time being, so he could only throw them aside. Raising his head to look at the sky, which alternated between light and darkness, he narrowed his eyes. He knew that he should be able to reach Longquanin by the end of the day, and he relaxed a little. The princess had married far away, so the journey should be much slower than it was now. But Fan Xian had a hidden concern, so he took advantage of the fact that no one in the diplomatic mission dared to say anything, and sped up the journey. Seeing that they were about to enter the capital, he finally stopped thinking about his family. Tomorrow, he should be able to see Wan. He wondered if her health had improved. As for his sister, if Uncle Wu Zhu was in the capital, she should be fine for the time being. Getting into the carriage behind them, he looked at Yin Bingyan, who was pretending to be asleep. He frowned and reprimanded him. "You caused this mess, and you will have to deal with it. We are about to enter the capital. Are you going to let her follow Her Highness? If Northern Qi finds out that we are sheltering their felon, how will the court explain it?" Yin Bingyan opened his eyes, but turned his head away from looking at his superior. He looked at the golden paddy fields outside the carriage window, and a trace of struggle flashed through his eyes. In the end, he only said lightly, "Shenzhong's death was only one step in the Northern Qi Emperor's plan to seize power. As for her life or death, I believe Northern Qi will not care." Fan Xian looked at him, and his tone suddenly softened. "If you don't care about her life or death, then leave it to me." Yin Bingyan slowly turned his head, and a fierce look appeared in his eyes. "Killing her will do us no good. If I don't want to, I don't want to." Fan Xian shook his head. "I thought you were no ordinary person. I didn't expect you to be so self-deceiving." Yin Bingyan did not reply. He silently turned his head away, watching the farmers reap the heavy harvest outside the window. In the luxurious carriage at the front of the group, the great princess of Northern Qi sighed. She looked at her sister, who had been very close since childhood, and said nothing. Miss Shen, who had luckily escaped from Shangjing, was currently lying on the window frame in a daze. She looked at the same scenery as Yin Bingyan, but it was unknown whether she was thinking about her lover's heartlessness, the tragedy of her family being ruined, or the sorrow of leaving the country. Chapter 256. Just as the nobles in the diplomatic mission were having their own thoughts, the carriages had already arrived at the last relay station on the outskirts of the capital. Fan Xian sighed as he looked at the ceremonial guards and the array of troops placed there. He had no choice but to put off the issue of Lady Shen until after they entered the capital. If it was just him, There was absolutely no need for this woman to stay. It was just that Lady Shun had a friendship with the great princess, and Sir Yin Bingyan seemed to feel somewhat apologetic towards her. Officials from the Board of Rites, Honglu Temple, and Taichung Temple were already waiting there. Seeing the diplomatic mission's convoy slowly approach, they tidied up their clothes and respectfully welcomed the Princess of Northern Qi from the carriage. Fan Xian thought for a moment and called Gao De over. He had him take 2 tiger guards to guard the princess carriage. He could not let the court officials discover that there was another woman in the carriage. Actually, given his current position of power, there was no need to be so careful. Master Fan, you must have had a hard journey. Master Fan, you have greatly increased the prestige of the country. His Majesty is very pleased. Now that you have returned to the capital, I'm afraid you will soon be given an important position. Old Hu, you are wrong. Master Fan is now. Amidst a wave of flattery, Fan Xian entered the relay station, escorted by the officials. The Princess of Northern Qi was resting in the inner chambers. The procession to welcome the head envoy was even grander. If one did not know Fan Xian's identity, they would certainly be puzzled as to why the Qing court officials were so respectful to such a young, middle-ranked official. Fan Xian smiled and raised his hands to return the greetings of the officials around him. He was not annoyed, but he felt a little anxious. He looked around and found that he knew most of the officials who had come to greet him. Some were his colleagues from Taichung Temple, and some were nominal subordinates of the Chamberlain of Dependencies when negotiating with Northern Qi. Only the officials from the Ministry of Rites were respectful with a trace of fear. He understood the reason for this. After all, Guayu had been brought down by him. As soon as he sat down and took a sip of tea, he asked, "What is the next procedure? Is there an edict from the palace? And when can the diplomatic mission enter the capital?" Without waiting for the officials to reply, he laughed at himself and said, "I am the head envoy, but I am still not clear about the process." The officials of the Board of Rites had finally gotten a chance to get close to him, and they did not want to miss it. One of the vice-counselors hurriedly replied, "Do not worry, Master Fan. The Board of Rites has arranged everything. The palace has already made arrangements, and everything is in order." Another subordinate from the office of the Grand Herald said, "His Majesty knows that the officials of the diplomatic mission have been away from home for a long time and are very homesick. Thus, he did not issue an official edict. He only ordered the diplomatic mission to enter the capital. After you enter the capital, you will first go to the palace." Before he could finish speaking, an official wearing a 4th-rank official uniform walked in from outside, and the officials in the room hurried to welcome him. Fan Xian fixed his eyes on him and went up to him with a smile. He patted him on the shoulder and said, "Sir Run, why are you here?" The newcomer was Ren Shaoan, the vice minister of the office of the Grand Herald, a disciple of Fan Xian's father-in-law. Seeing that Fan Xian was safe and sound, Ren Shaoan was relieved. He smiled bitterly and said, "The marriage of the princess of the kingdom of Qi is a major event. If I, a laborer of the Taichung Temple, did not come, then there is no need for the imperial censorate to come. I have no choice but to resign." Fan Xian smiled, but he was puzzled. He knew that the diplomatic mission would arrive today, so why did this vice minister come so late? He greeted the officials in the room, and then pulled Ren Shaoan out of the door. "What is this all about?" he asked. Ren Shaoan knew that although this man in front of him was young, his temperament was soft and gentle, and he had overthrown so many officials in the capital. He did not know whether or not he should say anything, but Prime Minister Lin Ruofu had already retired and returned to his hometown. The Lin family could only rely on Fan Manor in the capital. Considering the two sides, he could not help but hesitate. "Sir Fan," he said, "what is it that you ask about?" Fan Xian stared into his eyes. "I am not an idiot. The return of the diplomatic mission to the capital is a major event. When we left Shangjing, the court of Northern Qi should be aware of the scale of the ceremony. A princess is in the diplomatic mission, so why are all the officials there to welcome her? Where is Xianqiwu? And where are the officials from the Board of Rites? The princess is getting married, and the palace should at least send some old servants. You are a man of the Taichung Temple. So you are in charge of royal affairs. If I did not ask you, who would I ask? Ren Xiaoan laughed bitterly and said, Today, unfortunately, Enchanting went there. The elders of the Ministry of Rites also went there. Fan Xian, don't blame me. I came here in a hurry, because I offended them. Which side is that? Fan Xian was slightly surprised. Ren Xiaoan continued to laugh bitterly. The Great Prince is also returning to the capital today. He has set up camp less than 3 miles away from you. So this is too much of a coincidence. The people from the Board of Rites, the Bureau of Military Affairs, and the Ministry of War are all there. So the diplomatic mission is naturally quieter. After saying this, he continued. Fan Xian, we are friends, and I am not afraid to say it out loud. You are also a person with a crystal heart. Do you really care about these superficial formalities? Fan Xian now understood what was going on. He laughed and shook his head. I just want to get back to the capital. But the princess is a princess after all. If the court treats her poorly, it will incite gossip, and it will not be good. He finally understood why the reception of the diplomatic mission was so much weaker. After all, it was the great prince who had military power. The court officials would naturally rush there. Even if it was to flatter him, they had to flatter him. Fan Xian waved his hand to stop Ren Xiaoan's explanation. He asked curiously, the edict at the beginning of the year clearly stated that the great prince would only lead his troops back to the capital when the grass was growing in autumn. It is only the beginning of autumn, why is he back? It is said that the Empress Dowager misses her eldest grandson. Ren Xiaoan gave a meaningful laugh. So they set off early. The Western Army is stationed in Dingzhou. This time, the great prince is leading 200 soldiers back to the capital. Fan Xian shook his head. I don't know if those officials from the Board of Rites have learned from the Guo family. The diplomatic mission is entering the capital, and the prince is returning to the palace. With so many people, did they not know to make arrangements to send a letter along the way? No matter the route, it is not impossible to delay it for a day or two. Now they are all crowded on the road outside the city. What do we do? The Board of Rites and Honglu Temple sent letters to you along the way, telling the diplomatic mission to slow down. Who would have thought that the diplomatic mission would not rest for a day, and would go straight back to the capital? That is why they are all crowded together. Fan Xian laughed and said nothing. The diplomatic mission was traveling thousands of miles back to the capital. This was his original intention. Rong, when the arrangements are made, the diplomatic mission will enter the city in 2 days. What do you think? Ren Xiaoan looked at him carefully. He didn't know how long this man had been in the Overwatch Council, and whether he had inherited Director Chen Pingping's arrogance. The new minister of the Board of Rites is too embarrassed to come to the diplomatic mission, he said. So he asked me to pass on a message. Damn it, I'm in a hurry to go home and hug my wife. Fan Xian was familiar with him, and his words were a bit presumptuous. You want to wait 2 days? Be careful that when you come to the manor in the future, my wife will punish you. Ren Xiaoan's forehead was covered in sweat. Of course, he knew what kind of person Fan Xian's wife was. Although she was always ill, her background was incomparably deep. Fan Xian did not want to fight over these things with the great prince, whom he had never met. Furthermore, he had no right to do so. He smiled and patted Ren Xiaoan on the shoulder. Don't worry. I won't make things difficult for you. He thought for a moment, then said, I will go and report to the princess, in case there is a rift between the two of them before they even meet. As officials, we have to explain. Ren Xiaoan was dumbfounded. He watched Fan Xian walk towards the room where the princess was temporarily resting. He thought, what are you playing at? You don't say anything. So what if you drag things out for 2 days? If the princess doesn't want to be at a disadvantage, then I'm afraid your explanation will become a provocation. How could he know that Fan Xian, this mischievous fellow, was in a hurry to go home? As for how the great prince and princess would fight, he couldn't be bothered to care. Ren Xiaoan was wiping his sweat as he waited outside. He noticed another 4th-rank official running in from outside the courier station. The official's back was drenched in sweat. It was early autumn, and it was hot and dry. He was at a disadvantage running from both sides. It was Enchanting, the vice minister of the office of the Grand Herald. Seeing Ren Xiaoan there, he cupped his hands in greeting and said in a low voice, "You're early." Ren Xiaoan knew that Xian Chiwu was close to the Eastern Palace. Originally, they were not close, but after the Prime Minister's departure, the bureaucracy had placed Ren Xiaoan on Fan Xian's side. To the princes, there was no such thing as intimacy, so the two of them had become more familiar. He jokingly scolded, "With Master Fan here, if I didn't come, the princess would scold me. You, on the other hand, have always been close to him. Why have you only come now?" Xian Chiwu was a little surprised. He smiled bitterly and said, "Master Fan is not that kind of person." Thinking of the absurdity of the day, he couldn't help but laugh at himself. The great prince and the diplomatic mission have arrived outside the capital at the same time. I don't think the people from the Board of Rights know what to do. Even the officials of the 3 houses, 6 departments, and 4 temples are confused. Which side should they welcome first? Hearing this, Ren Xiaoan and Xian Chiwu fell silent at the same time. The scene was a little strange. After a long time, the two of them coughed twice. The reason for this was because they realized that their conversation just now had placed the great prince and the diplomatic mission on the same level of importance. Could it be that after Fan Xian took control of the Overwatch Council and gained a reputation for himself, he could be mentioned in the same breath as an army-wielding prince? Xian Chiwu shook his head and threw this absurd thought to the back of his mind. But he knew that since the officials were so troubled, they had subconsciously placed Fan Xian in a very high position. Well, Master Fan had only been in the capital for a little over a year, and he had already done so much. It was indeed a little surprising. Although there was a foreign princess in the diplomatic mission, the officials' true intentions were naturally to curry favor with the Fan family and the Overwatch Council. "Master Fan, you didn't say anything when you didn't see me earlier, did you?" Xian Chiwu asked carefully. Ren Xiaoan shook his head. Xian Chiwu felt a little more at ease. He smiled and said, "Actually, for the great prince to arrive first, I have to greet him on behalf of the Eastern Palace. After all, Master Fan is an official, and he has his own status." "I don't have any status." Fan Xian walked over and greeted Xian Chiwu. "I can't believe you were so straightforward when you drank with me, calling me brother. I've been abroad for months, and you didn't come to welcome me. I'm angry, haha." He was angry, but he was laughing. Xian Chiwu smiled helplessly. He was about to say something when he saw Fan Xian's warm smile. He said quietly, "For the sake of reason, you are the Vice Minister of the Office of the Grand Herald, and you are in charge of all diplomatic affairs. Instead of greeting the diplomatic mission, you went to greet the great prince. Are you going to the Bureau of Military Affairs to become a counselor?" These words were spoken calmly, but there was a hint of displeasure in them. Xian Chiwu was slightly surprised. He thought that Fan Xian should not be someone who cared about such things, and he should not be so stupid as to show his displeasure on his face. Fan Xian cupped his hands in salute to the 2 high-ranking officials of the court. He straightened his back and said, "The diplomatic mission will enter the capital today. Please make the arrangements. If the Ministry of Rights cannot find anyone, you can go and find them." There was a buzzing sound. The 2 vice ministers suddenly felt their heads swell. They had never imagined that Fan Xian would be so bold as to fight with the great prince. But the palace seemed to have forgotten about this matter. There was no decree. If the diplomatic mission wanted to enter the capital first, it was not a big problem. The problem was, the great prince was there. Ren Xiaoan coughed and looked at Fan Xian. He wanted to remind him that Xian Chiwu was a follower of the crown prince, and that he should not show such disrespect to the great prince in front of him. But Fan Xian accepted all of his flirtatious glances. He still smiled and said, "The diplomatic mission will enter the capital first. This is the wish of the princess. You go and make the arrangements. As for the great prince, let them wait." Having said this, he flicked his sleeves and left the relay station, instructing his subordinates to begin preparations for their entry into the capital. He left the 2 stupefied vice ministers behind him, wondering just what kind of person he was. He dared to fight with the great prince. The expression on Xianchu's face kept changing. In the end, he gritted his teeth and said, "The palace has not said anything. I don't care." Ren Xiaoan asked curiously, "If you don't care, where are you going? You are a vice minister of the office of the Grand Herald. If you do not care about the diplomatic mission's entry into the capital, be careful that people do not accuse you." Xianchu smiled and said, "I don't care about the Great Prince. This is my duty. Even if the Great Prince is not happy, I have an explanation. I will go with the diplomatic mission. But Yu Taichung Temple is in charge of the royal family. On one side is the emperor's son, and on the other side is the emperor's future daughter-in-law. Which side are you going to care about?" Ren Xiaoan cursed him countless times in his heart, but he had a close relationship with Fan Xian. He could only shake his head and hurry to the Great Prince's side. He wanted the Ministry of Rites to make preparations, and at the same time, he wanted to talk to the Great Prince. He didn't know what would happen on the only official road outside the city gates. After boarding the carriage, Fan Xian looked at Yin Bingyan and shook his head. "Don't show your face. Once we enter the capital, Sir Yin will send someone to pick you up. Remember, before you report, don't let anyone know about you." Yin Bingyan nodded slightly and suddenly said, "Why fight? He is the Great Prince, the Emperor's son. What right do you have to fight with him? You are not a stupid person. Why would you do something so stupid?" The prince, Fan Xian, sat beside him and waited for the carriages to depart. He smiled and said, "Is this thing very rare? Besides, it is not me who wants to fight with him. It is some noble who wants to fight with him." Yin Bingyan did not understand. Fan Xian laughed and said, "The young couple has not even met, and they are already fighting for the right to speak in the family. The princess has always had a calm personality, but when she heard that the Great Prince was going to enter the city first, she frowned and stood on the east side of the river with her mouth wide open. This woman really does not understand. East side of the river? What river?" Yin Bingyan rebuked him. "You were the one who picked this matter. I don't understand. You haven't even returned to the capital, and you are already shedding all pretense of cordiality with the Great Prince. What are you thinking? Very good. It seems that you are beginning to consider problems for me, your superior." Fan Xian's face was bitter. "I really did not pick the princess." Who would have thought that this quiet princess would also believe in the principle of the east wind, suppressing the west wind? This came from chapter 82 of The Stone. It had not yet been written, and Fan Xian was only referring to it. He felt happy. He really was in a hurry to get home. It was that simple. As for why I offended the Great Prince, the reason is very simple. It is very difficult for me to find another opportunity like today, an opportunity to show how much I dislike the Great Prince. Why do you want to do this? Although you have been in the north for a long time, I believe that you have learned a lot about me from the diplomatic mission." Fan Xian looked at Yin Bingyan. Yin Bingyan nodded. "How is my relationship with the Eastern Palace? On the surface, there seems to be some conflict, but in reality, the Crown Prince thinks very highly of you. He was the one who took care of you during the spring examination. Later on, when you went on the diplomatic mission, he also took great care of you and was very friendly." "Correct. That is why I am very protective of the Eastern Palace." He was talking about the spring exam cheating scandal. Fan Xian did not explain it clearly to Yin Bingyan. He continued, "Furthermore, I am on good terms with Crown Prince Jing, and Crown Prince Jing was sent by the second prince. So my relationship with the second prince is not bad." Yin Bingyan immediately understood why Fan Xian offended the Great Prince. "My relationship with the Eastern Palace and the second prince is not bad. If my relationship with the Great Prince is also good in the future." A self-mocking smile appeared on Fan Xian's face. "Let me ask a young man who has the Overwatch Council and the palace treasury in his hands, and is on good terms with 3 princes at the same time. What is this young man trying to do? Do you think those concubines in the palace will like me?" Today the outside of the capital was a mess. The palace, the only place that had the power to calm the turmoil, had not yet issued an edict. As a result, the officials were sweating profusely and cowering in front of the city gate. They looked at the 2 rows of carriages coming from afar, and they could not stop cursing in their hearts. They cursed Fan Xian's mother. The great prince's mother was the emperor's woman, and they did not dare to curse her. The great prince's bodyguards were all valiant soldiers from the western battlefield. Seeing that this stupid diplomatic mission dared to fight with the great prince, they had long since become enraged. But the great prince's military discipline was extremely strict, so they had to endure it. They watched as the seemingly endless carriages of the diplomatic mission slowly passed by them. Among the horsemen, one of the great prince's barbarian generals could not bear it any longer. He yelled, "Where did this official come from? Do you not know the rules? Do you want to die?" Both sides of the carriages stopped at the same time. The atmosphere was extremely tense. Fan Xian disembarked from the carriage and pretended to straighten his clothes. He faced the faintly visible carriage of the great prince from afar and bowed. "Your humble servant Fan Xian pays his respects to the great prince." "Fan Xian? You are Fan Xian?" A powerful voice came from the other side, with a hint of disdain in it. "I didn't think that Chener's husband would be you. You dare to compete with a prince, you have guts. But aren't you a little too stupid?" Fan Xian smiled and spoke very respectfully. "I do not dare to fight with your highness, but..." Before he finished speaking, the calm and confident voice of the great princess of northern Qi came from the unusually luxurious carriage behind him. "I am a weak woman, and I have come all the way to the south. Does your highness insist on me staying outside the city for a few more days?" The great prince's bodyguards were stunned. It seemed that they had just remembered that there was a noble person in the diplomatic mission. This woman would soon become the great princess, the mistress of these people. Fan Xian glanced at the great prince's horsemen. This was a family matter, and he would not interfere. Chapter 257. The great prince had been fighting outside for many years. Although the western barbarians were no longer as fierce and barbaric as they had been in the past, the battlefield was, after all, filled with wind and snow. Knives were stained with blood. After a few years, this prince was very different from his brothers in the capital. He had fewer empty words and more ruthless military temperament. On this return to the capital, as the great prince was the leader, he could bring 200 to 500 personal guards with him. But in the end, he only chose 200 of them. Presumably, he did not want the officials in the capital and the palace to worry too much. But these personal guards were all valiant people. At this time, they were fighting with the diplomatic mission and could not suppress their murderous aura. These 200 personal guards rode on horses with arrogant and disdainful expressions. People who came from the battlefields would always find these civil officials displeasing to the eye. But these hundreds of eyes looked toward the carriage. They knew the identity of the person in the carriage and did not dare to say anything. The person in the carriage was the future imperial concubine. No matter how straightforward these vicious people from the Western army were, they would not be stupid enough to offend their future mistress for the sake of fighting for passage. The director of the Board of Rights came out 10 li from outside the city. At this time, of all the officials present, he was the most senior and had the highest rank. In the midst of the awkward silence, he uncomfortably stood up and prepared to smooth things over. He said a few words, but in the midst of the neighing of the horses, not many people heard him clearly. A series of neighs suddenly rang out. The cavalry of the Western Army's personal camp parted like flowing water. The dozens of steeds were controlled with extreme precision, creating a large space on the not-so-wide official road. Amidst the clattering of hooves, a general clad in profound armor came forward on horseback. Fan Xian was standing beside the great princess carriage. His brows furrowed slightly, and he was about to move out of the way. Unexpectedly, the horses of the great prince's bodyguards took advantage of the opening of the path and charged straight over. These soldiers had been outside for many years and did not know what kind of person Fan Xian was. Earlier, they had seen this handsome young man speak, and they were already full of anger. Now they wanted to frighten him to the ground and humiliate him. Thus, the large horses in front of them brushed past Fan Xian's body. It looked extremely dangerous. Fan Xian wore a smile on his face. He bowed slightly to the general on the horse, completely ignoring the jumping, neighing, and provoking steeds beside him. "Your subject Fan Xian greets your highness." The one galloping over was the great prince of Qing Kingdom. His eyes were bright and spirited, and there was a natural murderous intent in them. His brows were straight, his nose was straight, and his cheekbones were slightly high, but they did not appear ugly. On the contrary, there was a hint of valiance about him. The great prince sat on his horse, his entire body reflecting light in his armor. He looked like a god, and no one dared to look directly at him. Thus, Fan Xian did not look directly at her. He only smiled shyly and slightly lowered his head in greeting. It seemed that the great prince had not thought that the civil official in front of him, who appeared somewhat reserved and lowly, was the most popular person in the capital, Fan Xian. He couldn't help being slightly startled and suddenly said, "This June? Why is he smiling like a woman?" The great prince's temperament was straightforward, and he was just not in the mood to speak. However, his personal guards at his side heard it, and thought that their master was purposely humiliating this civil official, who dared to compete with them for the road. So they all began to laugh. Their laughter rose to the sky on the outskirts of Jingdou. There was an indescribable feeling of disdain. The great prince was slightly startled, but he was too lazy to care. A trace of a smile rose to the corners of his lips. And those proud horses were getting closer and closer to Fan Xian. He could already hear the sound of the steed's nostrils flaring. A few long horse faces closed in on him. It was the great prince's personal guards, who wanted to use their horses to force the diplomatic group off the road. Fan Xian frowned slightly. He had not expected that the great prince would not give face to his future wife, and it seemed that he would not give face to his distant brother-in-law. Seeing the horse faces getting closer and closer, the excitement in the eyes of the huge horses gradually grew. He knew that these war horses were not easy to control and were bloodthirsty. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart and prepare to temporarily retreat. In any case, he had already achieved his goal of making enemies with the great prince. There was no need to truly turn against him. Fan Xian had never had much to do with the military, and this was one of his biggest weaknesses. If the old generals of the Bureau of Military Affairs thought that he was purposely trying to make the Western Army lose face, he was afraid that in the future, he would not have an easy time in court. That was what he thought, but he forgot that his subordinates did not think the same way. Seeing that the commissioner was in danger, the Overwatch Council officials and swordsmen hidden in the diplomatic group all revealed themselves. Like a dozen wisps of smoke, they wandered out, either standing on the carriages or finding high ground on the side of the road. They all raised the crossbows in their hands and aimed them at the approaching horses. This cannot be done. The director of the Board of Rights was shocked. Using force outside the capital? If news of this were to spread, how could the court maintain its reputation? Naturally, he would no longer be the director of the Board of Rights. Would the great prince have any good to do? Even if Fan Xian had the backing of the Overwatch Council, would the emperor not reward him with a paddle? Only now did the welcoming officials react. Seeing the cold faces of the Overwatch Council officials, they remembered Fan Xian's frightening identity. One by one they shouted, "All of you stop! What nonsense!" The great prince looked at this scene coldly. For some reason, he found this Overwatch Council dog called Fan Xian to be much more pleasing to the eye. In his heart, anyone who dared to face him directly was someone with guts. At this moment, Fan Xian was secretly complaining. These Overwatch Council officials had been trained well by him along the way. He did not think that at this moment, they would be worried about his safety and not care about the face of the court. They dared to aim their crossbows at the Western Army heading east. It must be known that these soldiers had fought for the country for a long time. If news of this got out, even the old cripple Chun would be upset for a while. The great prince laughed. It seemed that he could see the worry in Fan Xian's heart, and was ready to see how he would deal with this matter. Seeing that someone dared to threaten them, the blood and murderous aura that they had cultivated over the years suddenly surged. They roared in unison, raised their spears and drew their bows, and surrounded the front of the diplomatic group. At the same time, the horses had already surrounded Fan Xian. Fan Xian raised his hand and bent his middle and ring fingers. Surrounded by the horses, he made a clear gesture. After the Overwatch Council officials and swordsmen saw this gesture, their faces were expressionless. They put away their crossbows, dismounted from their horses, and returned to their ranks. They did this in unison, without the slightest hesitation. The great prince rode on his horse. His expression did not change in the exposed half of his face, but in the depths of his heart, he was somewhat shocked. This seemingly weak official in front of him was actually so strict with his subordinates. In such a situation, with one gesture, he could have everyone immediately stop. This kind of discipline was something that even his Western army probably could not achieve. The great prince knew that in the outskirts of Jingdo, nothing could actually happen. Furthermore, the crown prince and the second prince were waiting at the city gate. So he gently lifted the reins of his horse and waved his hand to signal for the soldiers to retreat. A wave of disorderly clattering rang out. The soldiers unwillingly put away their bows and pulled their horses back. Compared to the imposing manner of the Overwatch Council, it was quite a bit lacking. The great prince couldn't help but furrow his brows. At this moment, the horses surrounding Fan Xian were also preparing to pull back. Unexpectedly, they were too close. In addition, the yellow soil on the road was gradually drying. Dust rose up and poured into the nose of a large horse. The horse kicked its hooves and twisted its long neck. Immediately, it made the horses panic at the same time. Two horses charged toward Fan Xian at the same time. This was purely an accident. The great prince watched from a distance of 30 feet. He couldn't help but feel shocked. If he actually ran over and killed this favorite of his father's, then all of his efforts in the West would probably be for naught. But he immediately remembered Fan Xian's legendary abilities and couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. He thought to himself, since you are the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, you can't be run over and killed by a few horses, right? Hiss! The horses charged forward and immediately buried Fan Xian in the rising dust. Only the aces could faintly see two streaks of light in the dust. With two muffled thuds, the dust gradually settled. Fan Xian still maintained that hateful smile. He stood somewhat cautiously in the center of the field. The two startled horses swept past his body and collapsed to the ground. The rider seemed to have fainted, but the two horses were not so lucky. The heads of the horses had already flown far away with two spurts of blood. The bodies of the horses shook the yellow soil on the road. Behind Fan Xian, two machete men dressed in brown clothes held tightly to long knives. Their faces were cold, and their eyes were cold. They looked at the great prince's personal camp not far away. Two knives came down together and beheaded two horses. What a fast knife, and what a fast attack. The great prince's eyes narrowed slightly. Looking at the two machete men behind Fan Xian, he didn't know why, but he felt that their attacks were somewhat familiar. His fingers gently tapped the armor on the outside of his thigh, making a slight clanging sound. Looking at Fan Xian, he said word by word, "Sir Fan is indeed powerful. I have fought for many years. I did not think that as soon as I returned to the capital, I would have two horses beheaded by you in front of everyone. So this is how the court welcomes soldiers home." Fan Xian sighed and raised his hand to cover his mouth and nose. It was as if the smell of the horse blood was a bit piercing. He explained, "Your Highness, even if you gave me 1,000 guts, I would not dare to kill your Highness's war horses." Only now did he realize that although this prince was crude, he was not stupid. Every word was connected to him. Only when he heard the great prince refer to himself as Your Highness, did he remember that when the great prince was ordered to return to the east, the emperor had already made the great prince a king. This was the first of all the descendants of the royal family to be made a king. Thinking of how he had greatly offended him today, Fan Xian couldn't help but furrow his brows. As the great prince's expression gradually grew cold, his personal guard at his side walked forward and said something. Hearing these words, the great prince's gaze focused. Looking at the two machete men behind Fan Xian, he furrowed his brows and said, "So they are tiger guards." Gao De said in a low voice from behind Fan Xian, "The one beside the great prince is a tiger guard." Fan Xian raised his eyebrows and asked, "You know him?" "I do not, but I know," Gao De replied in a low voice. The horse blood on his long knife was still dripping down. Fan Xian said, "Since you are a tiger guard, how can you be so rude to the great prince?" Gao De said in a low voice, "Young master, the emperor has decreed that I only need to protect you. As for who the other party is, there is no need to consider." The two of them spoke very quietly. A strange expression suddenly appeared between Fan Xian's brows. After a moment of silence, he suddenly bowed to the great prince's horse and did not say anything more. At this time, the great prince's personal guards had long since carried the two unconscious soldiers back. They were only waiting for the prince's order to rush over and give the diplomatic mission a good beating. At this moment, the great prince sank into silence. Suddenly, the great prince rode up to Fan Xian's side. He lowered his body slightly and said in a low voice, "I like your temper, but it is inauspicious for you to kill a horse. After you enter the capital, be careful that I make trouble for you." Fan Xian looked at this man and sighed, "Great prince, this really has nothing to do with me. Please understand, your highness." The great prince snorted coldly. As a member of the royal family, he naturally knew the authority of the tiger guards. He thought that it was the bodyguards his father had arranged for the diplomatic mission, and that it had nothing to do with Fan Xian. But deep in his heart, he was still extremely angry. "It was my idea. If your highness is dissatisfied, please do not make things difficult for Sir Fan." After a long period of silence in the carriage, the princess's voice finally rang out again. At this time, all the officials surrounded them. Ren Xiao and held Fan Xian's hand. Exanchuwu held the great prince's leg, and the eunuchs of the palace tightly gripped the reins of the great prince's horse. The minister of rights blew his beard and stared, scolding the hateful soldiers back. There was also an elder of the Bureau of Military Affairs, who acted as a mediator. In short, the kingdom of Qing was mobilized to surround the great prince and Fan Xian, turning hostility into friendship and hostility into peace. With so many officials surrounding them, the conflict between the diplomatic mission and the Western army naturally had to end. Otherwise, if an elder were to be injured, it would be equivalent to not giving face to the royal court. What was the royal court? It was not the 3 ministries, 6 departments, and 4 temples. It was the face of all the officials. At this time, it seemed that something had happened in the distance at the city gate. Finally, there was a reaction. A rider arrived in a cloud of dust. After asking around for a long time, they finally understood that the diplomatic mission had arrived early to fight with the great prince. Such a big matter was not something the subordinates could handle, so they quickly reported it. At this time, both sides were fighting. Even if Fan Xian wanted to retreat, the princess in the carriage and the officials of the diplomatic mission did not want to retreat either. They insisted on entering the city before the great prince. But today, the great prince had lost 2 horses and had lost a lot of face. If he did not know that the tiger guards were his father's trusted aides and could not be ordered around by an official, he would have given the order to open the way. But at this time his temper had been roused. How could he let the diplomatic mission enter the city first? What bullsh*t, princess? In the future, you will be the one to wash my feet with. Unable to come to an agreement, the officials of the royal court grabbed his leg and stopped his horse. Naturally, the fight could not be fought, and so they could only resort to arguing. Although the soldiers of the Western army were skilled in battle, when it came to arguing, they were no match for the diplomatic officials of the diplomatic mission, who were skilled in the art of sophistry. From the rules of the royal court to the friendship between the 2 countries, from the emperor's heart to the official's face, the great prince gradually lost the upper hand. He stubbornly blocked the road, refusing to let the diplomatic mission enter. A bright yellow carriage slowly approached the scene of the accident, amidst the noise of the noisiest market in the royal court since the founding of the kingdom of Qing. Finally, someone noticed it and quickly stopped talking. By this time, Fan Xian had already retreated to the side of Yan Bingyun's carriage and was saying something. With Yan Bingyun's reminder, he immediately noticed the carriage and rushed forward to greet it. He tidied his official robes and followed the officials beside him in saluting. "Greetings, Your Highness." The crown prince had originally been waiting at the city gates to welcome the great prince back to the capital, according to the emperor's imperial edict. He had no idea that there would be such a ruckus, and so he had no choice but to come personally to mediate. Seeing that the crown prince had arrived, the great prince did not dare to scold him. He quickly dismounted, put on his armor, and walked in front of the crown prince's carriage. He was about to kneel. At this point, the crown prince had already gotten off the carriage. He hurriedly stopped him from kneeling down. He continued to say, "Big brother, you have armor on you. There is no need to bow. Furthermore, you are my elder brother. How can I allow you to bow to me?" The great prince's temperament was quite straightforward. The crown prince said he could not bow, so he did not bow. He straightened up and took off his helmet. Although the officials of Taichung Temple and the Board of Rites were muttering to themselves, this was a matter between the two brothers. Since His Majesty did not care about such etiquette, they as officials had no right to say anything. The crown prince looked at his elder brother's face and spoke with some emotion. Big brother has been fighting for the country for many years. He has been exposed to the elements and has lost weight. The great prince smiled and replied, "What's wrong with that? Riding horses outside is quite comfortable. You also know that I dislike staying in the manor. It's so boring. If it were not for grandmother insisting that I come back, I would have stayed outside for a few more days." The crown prince scolded, "It is not only grandmother, father, empress, Lady Ning, and us brothers all want you to come back earlier." The great prince glanced at Fan Xian and said, "I'm afraid there are some people who don't want me to come back earlier." The crown prince saw that his expression was not happy and asked what had happened. He couldn't help but laugh. This laughter was a bit strange. The officials did not know what the crown prince was playing at. They saw the crown prince gently wave his hand and have Fan Xian come over. He asked, "Did you fight with the great prince? Do you know that this is a serious crime?" Fan Xian smiled and explained, "I didn't have the courage. It really was the great princess of northern Qi, who had traveled a long way and caught a cold on the way. She could not bear to wait outside the city." The crown prince nodded slightly and took his brother's hand to walk to the side of the carriage. Quietly giving his greetings, he then turned and smiled at his brother. "Don't bother with these officials. Besides, you haven't been in the capital these 2 years, so you don't know what happened. Presumably you don't know Fan Xian. Come, let me introduce you." Fan Xian and the crown prince had not actually met each other much, but seeing the crown prince's warm expression, he knew that the crown prince wanted to show his close relationship with him in front of the officials. So he walked forward with a smile and bowed to the great prince. "I am Fan Xian of the Imperial College. Greetings, great prince." "You are a 4th-rank official." The crown prince scolded him. "How could you have forgotten your position?" Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. "On this journey north and south, I was a bit muddle-headed. Please forgive me, Crown Prince." The Crown Prince quietly said to the great prince, "Fan Xian is now helping the director." "I know that. The commissioner of the Overwatch Council. What a powerful official," the great prince said with a cold smile. The Crown Prince smiled and tried to smooth things over. "Never mind. Even if it wasn't for my sake, for Chener's sake, you can't get angry with him. Speaking of which, when you were young, you and Chener were very close. In the end, Fan Xian is also our brother-in-law. We are all family. What are you angry about?" The great prince snorted coldly and looked at Fan Xian, who was somewhat reserved. "This is exactly what I am angry about. In the palace, Chener is the apple of everyone's eye, and yet she is married to such a sissy. Just looking at it makes me angry. They haven't even been married for half a year. Yet he asked to go on a diplomatic mission and left his new wife in the manor. With such a passion for power and wealth, how could he be a good match for Chener?" Fan Xian could not help but laugh bitterly. Only now did he realize that he had completely gone in the wrong direction. It turned out that fighting for the right of way was indeed a family matter, but it was not a family matter between the great prince and his future wife. It was a family matter between the great prince and his brother-in-law. Chapter 258. In the end, Fan Xian just smiled without a trace of arrogance. He was extremely sincere, playing his part as a brother-in-law, and putting in the capital of an official. He let the surrounding officials see. Who would have thought that this matter of fighting for passage and offending people had come from his brain? Fan Xian was born with a set of advantages. As the saying goes, one cannot be a bad person. It could also be considered the path of a treacherous thief. He was very willing to offend and bully people behind their backs. But on the surface, he was very willing to give in. This was the way to truly reap benefits. For example, the eldest princess had been tricked by him several times and forced out of the palace by letters. But to this day, she still did not know that the mastermind behind the scenes was her son-in-law. She thought that this son-in-law would only suffer in silence and would still listen to her in the north, not daring to turn against her. He had always believed in one thing. It was good to be flamboyant and arrogant, but he had to be low-key flamboyant and eat pork in silence. It was said that those who could be moved must be moved, and those who could not be moved at the moment, he would not move even if you beat him to death. Naturally, the great prince was someone he could not touch at the moment, but today, he just had to fight with the great prince. This was already a great rebellion. Naturally, no one knew that he was doing this purely for the emperor in the palace to see. The great prince, who had a straightforward personality, was without a doubt the best acting target. Perhaps only Qin Pingping, that old fox, could guess a little of this. In the end, under the mediation of the crown prince, the two sides came to a compromise. The vanguard of the diplomatic mission and the great prince's personal army entered the capital together. But this was not in accordance with the rules, and made the director of the Board of Rites angry. It made the face of Taichung Temple full of fear. How to arrange the guards of honor became a big problem. The crown prince looked at Fan Xian and did not say anything, but he did not know where he came from. He pretended to scold him. "You are also making trouble." It was clearly agreed that the diplomatic mission would arrive in the capital the day after tomorrow. "Why did you suddenly arrive early? You left the court with no arrangements and caused all this to happen." Fan Xian smiled. "I am also in a hurry to go home. Your Highness, please forgive me this time. Who knows if there will be an imperial censor who will accuse me tomorrow." In fact, he also felt strange in his heart. After not seeing him for a few months, the Eastern Palace Master's complexion was much better than before. The slight timidity and gloom were no longer there, and his face was glowing. He did not know what good news he had received. Of course, he did not know that after the eldest princess left the royal palace and returned to Xinyang, one of the two mountains that had always been pressing down on the crown prince had suddenly disappeared. His mood immediately brightened, and in addition to the emperor's many comforting edicts, the crown prince's days were much better than before. In the hearts of the officials, they always thought that the crown prince had it easy, and the second prince must not be too comfortable. But at the city gate, when the crowd looked at the second prince, who was in the tent preparing to welcome the great prince back to the capital, they did not see a trace of unease on the face of this elegant nobleman. Instead, it was the young fellow by his side that attracted even more attention. This was the emperor's youngest son. The emperor had given birth to a total of 4 sons. The crown prince was not one of them, so this was the third prince, who had been raised deep in the palace. This year he was only 9 years old. This time, when the great prince returned to the capital, the emperor had ordered all the princes in the capital to come out and welcome him. This was a show of respect. At the same time, this young prince, who had never appeared in front of the court officials, had his first opportunity to make an official appearance. The second prince held the young prince's hand and bowed to the great prince. The great prince seemed to have a good relationship with the second prince. He stepped forward and gave him a bear hug, then rubbed the little fellow's head. In a rough voice he said, "How did you grow so tall?" The little fellow giggled, and his face revealed an innocent expression. He replied, "In the future, when I grow as tall as you, I will go out and fight the Hu people." This young prince's birth mother was a sister of the Fan Manor's Lady Lu, so in a roundabout way, he was somewhat related to Fan Xian. But when Fan Xian looked at this young and beautiful young prince, and saw the innocent smile on his face, his heart skipped a beat. He saw a trace of self-control in his innocent smile that did not match his age. Involuntarily, A slight smile rose to the corner of his mouth. He thought to himself, I have been pretending to be innocent and bashful since I was young. How dare you play this trick in front of me? Fan Xian really is selling a smile without knowing it. Naturally, the second prince also knew what had happened earlier. He smiled bitterly at Fan Xian. I say, brother-in-law, I think all the officials in the capital should thank the heavens and earth if you can make less trouble one day. Fan Xian's smile seemed even more bitter than a gold thread. He explained, It is really the princess of Northern Qi's will. I am just a mere official in Enji. How could I be so daring? The crown prince frowned imperceptibly, as if displeased with the second prince's tone of voice when he spoke to Fan Xian. He said lightly, Second brother, the ceremony is not finished. Let us address each other by official rank. This was a bit unreasonable. Earlier, the crown prince of the Eastern Palace had called Fan Xian brother-in-law quite affectionately, but now he refused to let the second prince call him that. The second prince's expression was as usual. He chuckled and made a sound of acknowledgement. He moved closer to Fan Xian and lowered his voice. Before the spring examination, I told you to go back to the manor and ask Chinner what she called me. Did you ask her? Only now did Fan Xian remember that matter. He shook his head and smiled. Your Highness also knows that something happened during the spring examination. I forgot for a moment. Today when I return to the manor, I will ask her. The second prince smiled and said nothing more. He took the third prince's hand and followed the crown prince and the great prince in front of them toward the city gate. Although the two of them spoke in low voices, it still reached the great prince's ears. This prince, who had spent many years on campaigns outside, could not help but have many doubts in his heart. Although he knew of Fan Xian's reputation, he was not in the capital, so he did not know what kind of power Fan Xian held in his hands. At this moment, he was shocked to find that whether it was the second prince or the crown prince, their words were very gentle toward Fan Xian. It was as if they were afraid that the officials present did not know that they had a very close relationship with Fan Xian. A mere official was valued so highly by the two sons of the imperial family that they were willing to lower their status. The great prince could not help but furrow his brows and feel a bit unhappy. Fan Xian, on the other hand, had other thoughts. He looked at the four princes in front of him, dressed in bright yellow and plain yellow, walking toward the pitch-black city gate. For a moment he was somewhat absent-minded. He wondered if there would come a day when he would stand among these four brothers. Autumn in the capital was indescribably beautiful. The sky was high and the clouds were light. The yellowing leaves drooped by the side of the houses, unwilling to be rushed into the water. The flowing water by the side of the street was inevitably a bit lonely. At the end of the long street, a corner of the distant eaves of the palace occasionally peeked out, hanging in the blue sky, displaying its majesty. The great prince's entourage had long since left with a lingering anger, but the envoys' carriages deliberately slowed down. Accompanied by a group of officials from the Chamberlain of Dependencies and Taichung Temple, they slowly made their way to the palace. Since they had already entered the capital, Fan Xian was no longer in a hurry. In any case, he could not go home immediately. He had to go to the palace gate to reply to the edict, so he finally had some spare time to look around. Although he had only been in the capital for a year, and was far less familiar with it than he was with Danzhou, for some reason, as soon as he entered, he saw the houses all around him, and smelled the unique smells of the capital. Fan Xian felt refreshed. Sir, you are in a hurry to return to the capital. There must be something at home. The voice of the princess of Northern Qi floated out from the carriage next to the steed. Fan Xian smiled but did not reply. He knew that she was deliberately trying to befriend this seemingly ordinary, but actually important official. But along the way, the two of them had communicated enough. Now that he was in the capital, he had many eyes and ears around him. It was best to avoid this last encounter. Furthermore, the princess had guessed what he was thinking, but he did not know how to respond. The Fan family was now very popular in the capital, and the entire household was safe. No one knew why he was in such a hurry. He urged the horse forward, coming to the side of Yan Bingyin's carriage. In a low voice he said, You must take her with you. if you don't want to cause me trouble. Inside the carriage, Yin Bingyan shook his head. He looked at Lady Shun, who he had tied up securely, but who still stared fiercely at him with those familiar eyes. He did not understand when Sir Fan had developed the hobby of being a matchmaker. He sighed and changed the subject. Sir, today's struggle over the road was not a wise decision. The Overwatch Council has always been neutral in the struggle between the princes, Sir once said, and what I heard has been confirmed, that the Crown Prince and the Second Prince both have expectations of you. Since this is the case, for the sake of fairness, you should not provoke the Great Prince. This is unavoidably contrary to the purpose of the council. Fan Xian was silent. He knew that what Yin Bingyan said made sense. As an official of the Kingdom of Qing, especially the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, he would either never have any dealings with the princes, or if he did, he would have to be impartial. Otherwise, the palace would be convinced that the Overwatch Council would not favor any of the princes. But Fan Xian could not do that, because he knew that his identity was not as simple as that of an official. If he was biased towards the princes, it would at most make His Majesty suspect that he was planning for power and riches in the future. He would never be as loyal as Chen Pingping. But if he were to be impartial, he feared that His Majesty would suspect that he was not willing to be an official. This was Fan Xian's greatest fear. The carriages arrived at Qingdao Square. There was no longer a need for the bailiffs of the capital government to maintain order, because they had arrived at a relatively quiet place where the officials lived. Naturally, there were not as many commoners standing on the side of the street watching the commotion. At this moment, one of the carriages broke away from the main group and quietly drove into an alley on the side of the street. Someone could faintly be seen inside to receive it. Although it was quiet, in reality, there were naturally court officials who saw it clearly. They knew that the composition of the diplomatic mission was complicated, and that it was probably the work of the Overwatch Council. Looking at Fan Xian's serious expression, no one dared to ask too much. Fan Xian's expression was naturally serious, because they were about to reach the royal palace, and the Vermilion Palace walls were right in front of them. A group of members of the diplomatic mission waited outside the palace gates. The imperial power was majestic, and naturally no one dared to relax their appearance. It was just that they had traveled thousands of miles, and inevitably it was tiring. After waiting for a long time, there was still no edict. The officials all felt a little uneasy, but they thought about how this diplomatic mission to northern Qi had carved out a lot of territory for the royal court. Furthermore, Fan Xian had made a great show of face in the northern Qi royal court. That carriage of old books did not seem to be worth much, but they thought that His Majesty should be proud of it. How could he leave them out in the cold? The officials of the Board of Rights, who accompanied them outside the palace gates, gradually became uncomfortable. Ren Xiaoan moved closer to Fan Xian and said quietly, "At this time, His Majesty should be meeting with the Great Prince. As officials, we naturally have to wait a little longer." Fan Xian smiled and said nothing. The carriage of the Northern Qi princess had already been let in by the eunuchs of the palace, and the important matters were more or less settled. Fan Xian could guess why the diplomatic mission had been left out in the cold outside the royal palace. The imperial soldiers of the royal palace looked coldly at the anxious and frightened officials outside the palace gates, without a trace of emotion on their faces. And the eunuchs guarding the palace gates naturally did not look directly at them. But Fan Xian's status was different from the others. He was a princess of the palace, and most importantly, she was a highly favored figure. Furthermore, she was a high-ranking official of the Overwatch Council. On this diplomatic mission, it was assumed that he would be rewarded in the coming days, so the eunuchs had already brought over a round stool and invited him to rest. Fan Xian was surprised. Is this in accordance with the rules? As he spoke, a head eunuch came over with a fawning expression and helped him sit on the stool. "I say, young Master Fan, I know that His Majesty has always favored you. Besides, you have traveled thousands of miles, so it is only right that you sit on a stool." "Oh, why is Eunuch Ho here?" Fan Xian pretended to be surprised. The eunuch in front of him was the one he had met the first time he had followed Lady Lu. and Ruoro into the palace. He knew that the eunuch had a good relationship with Fan Manor, so his face showed affection. And the eunuch had deliberately called him young Master Fan. Naturally, to put on a show of affection, Fan Xian continued with a smile. I have just returned from the outside, and I am truly poor. Today there is no reward. Eunuch Ho gave a shrill laugh and lowered his voice. Who doesn't know that young Master Fan is a master who can turn stone into gold? Furthermore, in the future, you will hold a mountain of gold. The old servant was about to say a few more flattering words when he heard the palace gates creak open. A eunuch ran out to deliver the emperor's verbal edict. Fan Xian quickly removed the stool and knelt in front of the palace gates along with the other officials. As he had expected, the emperor gave Fan Xian a good scolding. It was nothing more than relying on his talent, looking down on others, being extremely audacious, and so on. He also said that he was tired today, and told him to report back to the palace the next day. He ordered Count Sinan to discipline him well and punish him severely. At the end of the edict, however, the diplomatic mission was greatly rewarded, and that they would be rewarded in the future. The officials looked at each other. They had not expected that the diplomatic mission would receive such treatment on its first day back in the capital. They could not help but sigh. But some of the more cunning officials looked at Fan Xian with trepidation. His Majesty's verbal scolding had been fierce, but in the end he had done nothing. He had only ordered Count Sinan to discipline him. It seemed that Sir Fan was indeed favored by the emperor. Fan Xian kowtowed to accept the edict. His expression was somewhat awkward, but his heart was slightly happy. He stood up and patted his bottom. When he turned around, he saw an old acquaintance. It was Gong Dian, the current commander of the palace guards. When Gong Dian saw Fan Xian, a look of admiration appeared on his face. He was about to come up and chat with Fan Xian, but to his surprise, Fan Xian cupped his hands in salute and apologized. He leapt onto his horse, clamped his legs together, and with a wave of his whip, he galloped off into the wide square in front of the palace, leaving behind only a cloud of dust. Gong Dian was stunned. He and his subordinates stared blankly at the light smoke in the distance. Although there was no explicit order against riding horses in front of the palace, Fan Xian was probably the first official to be able to run so nimbly. Fan Xian had already taken care of matters in the council. As for Gao De and the other 7 tiger guards, they would be taken over by the relevant people. He galloped his horse along the long street, riding against the wind. He didn't know how long he had been running, but he finally entered the south of the city. The sound of hooves rang out on the long street, where the stone lion occasionally appeared in front of Fan Manor. It was already night, and the manors of the nobles and ministers on the long street had already been hung up with lanterns. There were only a few pairs, and they were not very eye-catching. Only the front door of Fan Manor was brightly lit. The front door was wide open, and a group of attendants, guards, and guests were standing outside in anticipation. Inside, Lady Lu had also lowered herself to instruct the servant girls and senior servants to heat up tea again and again, waiting for Fan Xian to return. News of the diplomatic mission's arrival in the outskirts of the capital had long spread into the city. They had originally thought that it would take at least 2 days to arrange the formalities before they could enter the capital, but the young mistress in the manor next door coldly said, "He will arrive today." Everyone knew that the present Lady Fan, Lady Lin, was no ordinary person. Since she said that Fan Xian would arrive today, then he would. That was why everyone had waited so long. As for the news of the fight with the Great Prince, no one in the manor knew. Otherwise, they would have been very worried. He's coming, he's coming. The sharp-eyed servants had long since seen the horses galloping in the distance. They all rushed down the stone steps and formed 2 groups. Amidst the rustling sounds, Fan Xian rode his horse over and flipped off. He gently kicked Ting Zijing's butt, who was preparing to use it as a horse stool. He laughed and scolded him. "Your broken leg, don't learn from those manor people." "Welcome back, young master," the 2 groups of servants called out in unison. Fan Xian smiled and said nothing. He took 2 steps up the stone steps, took a hot towel from a servant girl, and wiped his face carelessly. Then he took a cup of warm tea and rinsed his mouth. He knew that this was a necessary procedure, and there was nothing to be particular about. But when he returned to the manor and saw the familiar servants and servant girls, he was in a good mood. Even the smile of Lady Lu, who was behind the door, seemed less calculating and more sincere. "Your father is in the study." Lady Lu took the towel from his hand and quietly reminded him. Fan Xian nodded. Suddenly he furrowed his brows and shook his head. "Auntie." He swallowed the last word auntie and smiled. "I'll go see my sister and Wanner first. I'll go see father immediately." Lady Lu knew that the young master in front of her could not be constrained by filial piety, and could only nod helplessly. As soon as Fan Xian entered the manor, he saw a dark-skinned fat man rushing toward him. He couldn't help but turn pale with fright. It had only been a few months since he had last seen this prodigy in the accounting department. But he had no time to ask, and immediately shouted, "I'll report the bill later. I have something to do." Fan Xian paused and scolded, "I'm in a good mood today. If you don't pay attention to me, I won't bother to talk to you about accounts that you don't understand." Fan Xian was also surprised, but he laughed. For some reason, he thought of the row of 4 princes outside the city gate. He took something out of his robes and handed it to Fan Xian. He laughed and scolded, "What account talk? I think it's a nonsense talk. You go and play by yourself first. We're brothers, so don't play this reunion after a long separation." Fan Xian muttered to himself, "I don't want to play this game of brotherhood with you." Thinking this, he watched as Fan Xian entered the back of the manor. He felt very uncomfortable. After Fan Xian got married, he had his own manor in the back of Fan Manor. However, the 2 residences were connected, so it was only 1 manor and 2 residences. He and his sister were very close, and Wanner and Ruoro were very close, so Ruoro spent most of her time in this courtyard. And now that he had returned, it was natural that his father would stay in the study. But what was strange was that Wanner and his sister did not come out to greet him. This made Fan Xian quicken his steps. The serving girl next to him could not keep up, and panted as she replied, "The lady is still here, and so is the mistress." Fan Xian frowned, thinking that this was a very inauspicious thing to say. He didn't know who had trained this serving girl. He came to the door of his bedroom and gently pushed it open, but found that it was locked from the inside. Fan Xian was startled and didn't know what to say. He called out a few times, but no one answered. He was puzzled, and so he knocked harder on the door. If it weren't for the respect he had for his wife, he would have broken in already. After a while, he heard Cece's uneasy voice from inside. "Young master, the mistress is asleep. Please don't knock." Fan Xian's frown deepened. He didn't know what had happened. He had come all the way back, and Wanner had closed the door and refused to see him. He looked at the dim light inside the door, and said nothing. With a wave of his sleeve, he went to the other room. This time he didn't knock, but pushed the door open and entered. The girl in the room was startled, and she stood up. After seeing that it was Fan Xian, the indifference and wariness between her brows gradually melted, and her eyes flashed with unfeigned joy. She crouched down and said, "Brother, you're back." Fan Xian looked at Ruoro, and his previous unhappiness disappeared. He smiled warmly. "What? Are you not happy to see me back?" Fan Ruoro smiled and walked forward. She pulled on his sleeve and led him to sit down. "It's not like we haven't seen each other for a long time. Do you want me to make a big fuss before you're satisfied?" Fan Xian shook his head helplessly. "You always have such an indifferent personality. You won't change it even in front of me." Fan Ruoro smiled. "If I change it, will I still be Ruoro?" As she spoke, she poured a cup of tea and carefully brought it to her brother's lips. Fan Xian accepted it, but didn't drink it immediately. Instead, he stared at his sister's face, which wasn't very pretty, but was extremely refreshing. For a moment, the room fell into a strange silence. The 2 siblings were both very patient people, and they waited for the other to speak first. In the end, it was Fan Xian who felt sorry for his sister. He sighed. "Why do you have to do this? If there's anything, wait for me to come back and deal with it." A trace of sadness flashed across Fan Ruoro's face. She knew that her brother had seen through her plans. "I was waiting for you to come back and see you," she said softly. That's why it's been delayed until today. Fan Xian stood up and walked directly under her bed. He pulled out a package and took out an unremarkable box from the drawer behind the bed. He flipped the box over on the table. A few banknotes, a few beaded hairpins, and a few pieces of silver fell onto the table with a clatter. He furrowed his brows as he looked at the items on the table. Running away from home with just these few things, it's far from enough. Fan Ruoro was silent for a moment. She took out a self-defense dagger from her sleeve. Fan Xian was angry, happy and distressed. He looked at his sister and said, "You are a noble young lady. You don't know the dangers of the world. Even if you don't want to marry, don't you think about how worried father will be by running away from home? And what about me? Why don't you think about how I feel?" Fan Ruoro lowered her head. Her hands tightly gripped the corners of her sleeves. After a moment of silence, she said, "When did father ever really care about me? As for you, have you forgotten? You taught me to control my own destiny, especially when it comes to marriage. I can't let my family arrange it." Fan Xian was speechless. In this world, no young lady from a noble family would have such a rebellious idea, let alone put it into practice. His sister was brave, and even reckless enough to run away, because of the stories he had told her when she was young. He had taught her how to be a good person in his letters. Could it be that Cousin Mei had told her so much that New Jueshin was ready to awaken? He slapped the table uneasily. He really didn't know what his actions back then would bring to his sister. After all, this world was completely different from that world. Different thoughts could be a dagger that could hurt oneself. He suddenly raised his head and said gently, "But an arranged marriage is not necessarily a bad thing. You have never been with Hongcheng. How do you know if your marriage will be a happy one?" Fan Ruoro's head was still lowered, but her voice did not soften. "You have known the Crown Prince since you were young. You know that I don't like him." If anyone else had heard this, they would have been scared half to death. How could the young lady of Fan Manor say something like whether she liked him or not? Fan Xian's mind was a mess, but he still tried to explain. "Not necessarily. Look at me and your sister-in-law. We were also arranged to be married, and now we live happily." Fan Ruoro suddenly raised her head. With a hint of determination and stubbornness, she said, "Brother, not everyone is as lucky as you and your sister-in-law." Fan Xian was stunned. This was the first time he had seen disapproval on his sister's face. Ever since they were young, Ruoro had always looked at him with admiration mixed with admiration. This was the first time he had heard Ruoro directly disagree with his opinion. He couldn't help but be shocked at the changes that had occurred to his sister. After a long silence, the expression on Fan Xian's face gradually softened. In the end, he laughed heartily. There was not a trace of falsehood in the joy in his laughter. He was indeed very pleased that the silly little girl had finally grown up and learned to stick to her own views. "Ruoro, do you trust me?" Fan Xian looked at his sister with a smile and an expression of encouragement. After hesitating for a moment, Fan Ruoro also showed her usual tranquil smile and nodded heavily. Fan Xian looked at the things on the table. He gently shook his head and smiled. "If you trust me, then don't play around with these things. I will take care of it." Ever since she learned that the palace had appointed her to be married, Fan Ruoro had sunk into silence. She knew how rebellious her thoughts were, and what kind of disaster it would bring if she went against the edict. But since she was young, she had been taught by her brother's letters. Deep in her heart, the seemingly weak, but actually strong seed of freedom had long been planted. But no one had said these thoughts to her. Deep in her heart, she was afraid that even her most trusted brother would oppose her decision. Hearing Fan Xian's promise, Ruoro's uneasiness for the past month suddenly disappeared like a gentle autumn breeze. Her tense nerves, which had been tense for a month, suddenly relaxed. Yes, her brother was back. Naturally, he would make the decision for her. The brother and sister had been separated for many months. Naturally, they had things to talk about. But Fan Ruoro saw that his expression seemed a little strange. Only then did she remember that if her brother wasn't talking to her father in the study, then he should be with her sister-in-law. Why would he come to her room? She thought of something and couldn't help but cover her mouth and laugh. "Brother, when you were persuading me earlier, Didn't you say that although you and sister-in-law were appointed to be married, you were happy? Why are you so worried now? Fan Xian's heart jumped. His sister and Wanner had a good relationship. Naturally, she would know why Wanner had shut herself in the room. He quickly asked, "What happened?" Fan Ruoro gave a rare mischievous smile. "I can't help you with this. Go ask sister-in-law yourself." Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He was upright and upright. What did he need to ask Wanner for? As he was thinking, he heard a servant girl call from outside. "Young master, the mistress has woken up." Fan Xian shook his head. He knew his wife was throwing a tantrum, but Wanner had always been a very graceful and pleasant woman. How could she be like those women in the harem? She knew he had worked hard to get home. If she didn't welcome him, then so be it. Instead, she closed the door on him. Thinking of this, as he walked to his room, a glimmer of anger gradually rose in his heart. But when he reached the door and heard the little Ling coming from inside, his anger immediately dissipated. On the contrary, a very interesting expression appeared on his face. The voice was clear and sweet. Who else could it be but Lin Wanner? And the little Ling was also very familiar. Do you know? Do you know? It should be green and red then." Fan Xian's expression was slightly embarrassed. The poem he had used to trick Haidang was only known to the Emperor of Northern Qi and the Empress Dowager and himself. How did it get to the capital in the south? You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.